The strangest thing about a medieval battle isn't the fighting, it's the moment the fighting stops. 1 minute you're surrounded by the deafening clatter of a metal, shouting commanders, screaming horses, panic prayers, and the unmistakable sound of someone realising too late that chainmail was not in fact stab-proof. And then, as if someone pulled the world's most dramatic curtain, everything collapses into a silence so heavy it presses against your ears. This is the silence of shock, of breathlessness, of thousands of men suddenly realising they are alive, or realising they aren't quite dead yet, but are definitely trending in that direction. The ground itself feels different in that moment, grass flattened, mud churned, footprints stamped into patterns so chaotic that archaeologists centuries later would stare at them and think, well, this was definitely stressful. The battlefield smells like a mixture of sweat, iron, churned soil and smoke, the kind of aroma that makes you deeply aware of why medieval perfume was mostly hope. Dust hangs in the air like a fog made of regret. Horses snort somewhere in the haze, confused and offended that humans insisted on doing whatever that was. And the birds, oh, the birds, they come flying back with the audacity of creatures who assume everything exists purely for their dramatic re-entry. Crows and ravens land on broken shields and spear shafts, looking around like, what did we miss? The good news, no one is swinging at you anymore. The bad news, everything else is. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Survivors stand frozen for a heartbeat, blinking the sweat out of their eyes, trying to understand the new soundscape. The groans of injured men who can finally afford to make noise, the clatter of dropped weapons, the hiss of a distant gear still catching onto something it shouldn't. There's the metallic ring of sword tips falling to the ground, the sound of armour settling as exhausted bodies slump out of their fighting stances, and the occasional very alive soldier stepping on a very not alive soldier and muttering an apology out of sheer habit. Some men check their bodies slowly, patting themselves down like someone looking for their keys. A bruise? Fine. A cut? Manageable. A missing finger? Well, that's a problem for future you. Many soldiers don't realise they're injured at all until they sit down and wonder why the ground is wet. Others clutch wounds and stagger toward the rear, while their friends cheer them on like medieval hype men. You're good, you're fine, you're only slightly stabbed. The officers react differently. A few stand dramatically atop discarded shields, trying to look victorious while quietly gasping for breath. Others attempt to bark orders but produce only a hoarse squeak, because shouting for 3 hours straight has consequences. Horses wander without riders, reins dragging, occasionally nudging someone who looks vaguely familiar. Armour creaks as men shift weight from one aching leg to another, suddenly aware that metal is very heavy when you're not fueled by adrenaline and fear. Then there are the men who are simply overwhelmed. They sit down exactly where they are, on stones, on shields, on anything that hasn't been recently impaled, and stare into the distance with the expression of someone who has just remembered they left the oven on. These soldiers don't speak. They don't move. They just process. After all, the mental jump from battle mode to still alive is a cliff, not a staircase. Enemies, those still breathing, add their own layer to the strange quiet. Some call out for help, some beg for mercy, others pretend to be dead with performances so committed they'd win an Oscar. A few wounded foes even attempt negotiations on the spot, waving a shaky hand as if to say, "Before you decide my fate, might I offer you a mutually beneficial financial opportunity?" Stillness doesn't mean safety. Survivors keep scanning the field, looking for any sign of an enemy regrouping. A lone figure moving in the distance could be a retreating foe, or someone who just really wants to go home. No one knows. Everyone is too exhausted to find out. Even the wind seems cautious, sweeping across the field as if it expects someone to start shouting again. Slowly, movement returns. Men bend to retrieve dropped weapons, not because they want to fight, but because swords were expensive and no one was leaving without theirs. Others limp towards comrades, checking who survived, who fell, and who is lying very still but actually just napping without permission. Bonds forged in blood and terror often manifest in the gentle, trembling hand of a soldier rolling over a friend's body to check for breathing. Relief comes in gasps. Grief comes in silence. The first few minutes after combat weren't triumph, they were disorientation wrapped in exhaustion. A battlefield without noise is not peaceful, it is haunted. It is heavy. It is the moment everyone realizes what just happened, what they survived and what they left behind in the mud. And yet, in this terrible quiet, humanity creeps back in. Helping hands, shared water flasks, desperate laughter, whispered prayers. The battle may have ended, but understanding who actually won was its own separate conflict. One fought not with swords, but with bravado, selective memory, and the medieval equivalent of, "I totally meant to do that." Without instant replay, slow-motion analysis, or a commentator shouting, "And that's the game," commanders were left to interpret the chaos like sleep-deprived detectives reviewing extremely unhelpful clues. And the first clue they usually looked for, who was still standing. Unfortunately, medieval soldiers had the irritating habit of collapsing from exhaustion at the exact moment their side needed to look triumphant. The simplest indicator of victory, who controlled the battlefield, was not always easy to judge. Sometimes both sides retreated, leading to the awkward scenario of two armies marching away, and then proudly announcing to their kings that they had definitely, absolutely, unquestionably won. The good news was that honour allowed this kind of shameless optimism. The bad news was that history books later had to pretend both sides had a point. Commanders would look to the flag bearers next. Standards and banners were more than decorative fabrics waving majestically in the wind. They were medieval GPS markers pointing out where the commander was, where the troops should gather, and who should be very worried if that banner suddenly wasn't there anymore. If your army captured the enemy's standard, that was considered a solid indicator of victory. Nothing said triumph like waving your opponent's sacred embroidered symbol in the air while its original owner vowed never to embroider again. But banners were also awkward things. They fell easily. They broke. They were dropped when the bearer sneezed too hard. Once in a while, they got picked up by someone who had no idea what to do with it and carried it in the wrong direction, accidentally making half the army think they'd been flanked. Victory determination was, in short, not an exact science. Then came the body count, except, of course, no medieval commander had the time or the interest to run a precise census of corpses. Instead, they relied on visual impressions like, well, there are fewer of us than before, but there are much fewer of them. Body counting was especially unreliable because anyone who was unconscious might be mistaken as dead, and anyone who was pretending to be dead might be mistaken as very committed. Injured soldiers sometimes stood up midway through this process, terrifying whoever was counting them into adding at least 5 imaginary casualties. And even if the dead could be counted, some commanders simply chose not to. Losses were rarely reported accurately. If a commander's army had suffered horribly, he might simply tell the king, "We strategically decreased our numbers to improve efficiency." Kings pretended to believe this because they were also relying on selective information to maintain a sense of cosmic order. Messenger reports often added a special layer of chaos. A rider sent back mid-battle might deliver news of victory, only for the tide to turn an hour later. By the time the next messenger arrived, the king had already started planning celebratory feasts, minting commemorative coins, and bragging to neighbouring monarchs. Medieval politics thrived on confidence, and nothing created more confidence than claiming victory loudly and before the other side sent their messenger. Victory was 10% strategy, 90% confidence and yelling it first. Sometimes even soldiers on the same side didn't agree. One group might swear they'd witnessed a glorious rout, while another group insisted the enemy was only pretending to run away as part of a very clever trick. Some victories were declared simply because the commander survived. Others were declared because someone found the enemy commander's helmet, which was close enough to proof for most people. The terrain itself could confuse things. Fighting on hills, forests, or marshy ground meant parts of the army never even saw each other. Units might spend hours battling vigorously only to discover they had been fighting a patch of trees or an uncooperative bush. When they returned and saw the main force retreating, they might declare, "We won our portion," even though their portion was not technically animate. Of course, there were blowout victories where one side clearly demolished the other, but even then, commanders sometimes hesitated to declare triumph because medieval superstition loved nothing more than ruining a happy moment. A sudden storm could be interpreted as divine displeasure. A bird landing on the wrong banner might be seen as a bad omen. Commanders who were deeply religious sometimes worried that celebrating too early would cause God to rethink his support and say, "Actually, second thought, no." In the end, the declaration of victory was often as political as it was military. If your side held the field and the enemy fled, you won. If your side fled but the enemy fled faster, you still might be able to spin it. If your army technically lost but your nobles were alive to complain about it, you might argue that the defeat was temporary, symbolic, or simply misunderstood by the peasantry. And if worse came to worst, there was always the reliable fallback: blame the archers. The end of a medieval battle didn't mean relief, it meant the beginning of a desperate crawling lottery. As soon as the fighting stopped, the wounded became the loudest presence on the field, though not by choice. Groans, cries, whispered prayers, and the unmistakable sound of a grown man attempting to bargain with absolutely anyone. God, saints, strangers, passing birds, rose from every corner of the trampled earth. Some tried crawling toward their own lines, others tried crawling away from them, and a few simply lay still and hoped someone with a friendly flag came wandering by. Because in the brutal aftermath of battle, survival wasn't about strength, it was about getting noticed. And quickly. Men with shallow wounds sat up dazed, clutching arms or legs, blinking as if they'd woken up in the world's worst picnic. Others pressed cloth, hands, or loose pieces of armour over bleeding gashes, trying to figure out whether their insides were supposed to look like that. Some had arrows sticking out of places arrows should definitely not be, but removing them prematurely was a bad idea, so instead they sat tight, gripping the shaft like the world's most inconvenient accessory, muttering, "Don't pull, don't pull, don't pull," as if that might stop a well-meaning friend from doing exactly that. The severely wounded had fewer options. They called for help if they could speak, waved if they could lift an arm, or kicked the ground weakly if that was the only part of them still obeying orders. Others simply hoped their allies recognized their boots and pulled them out before darkness fell. Night on a battlefield was close to a death sentence. Temperatures dropped, predators prowled, cuts festered, and worst of all, visibility vanished. One could be alive at sunset and forgotten by sunrise, not because anyone wished them harm, but because there were simply too many bodies and not enough people left standing. Battlefield medics existed, though the word should be understood generously. Many were volunteers or soldiers too injured to fight but healthy enough to help others. Some were appointed assistants to the camp surgeon, while others were just compassionate men who couldn't walk past suffering without doing something heroic, or at least something vaguely helpful. These medics ran across the field holding buckets of water, strips of cloth, crude bandaging kits, or simply the unwavering confidence of someone who believed pressure stopped all bleeding. They checked pulses, lifted eyelids, and shouted instructions over the chaos. "You'll live." "He won't." "Tie that tighter." "Stop moving or your leg will fall off." Actual surgeons operated farther back at makeshift medical stations, but before wounded soldiers could reach that haven of questionable comfort, they had to be found, stabilized, and transported. This is where stretcher crews came in. Stretcher bearers were the unsung heroes of medieval warfare. 2 men carrying a canvas or wooden frame, walking with the steady determination of people who absolutely did not want to drop anyone, especially someone screaming. They moved through mud, stepped over corpses, dodged panicked horses, and braced themselves every time a wounded man demanded, "Tell me the truth, does it look bad?" while pointing at something that absolutely did. But stretcher crews couldn't save everyone. They prioritized those who were still screaming, the grim logic being that silencers were likely past help. It wasn't cruelty, it was triage. And triage in this era was little more than educated guessing. If someone's wounds looked treatable, onto the stretcher they went. If the injuries looked catastrophic, medics spared them unnecessary moving, and instead offered water, prayers, or a companion to hold their hand in their final minutes. Enemies wounded on the field faced a different fate. Some were aided by compassionate rescuers, especially if they were nobles worth ransoming. Others were ignored, avoided, or approached cautiously because an injured enemy could still be dangerous. A few wounded foes tried to convince rescuers they were valuable, shouting things like, "My family is very rich," or "I swear I'm important," which historically worked surprisingly often. Ransom was a business, and a noble with a stab wound was still a noble with a price tag. For common enemy soldiers without ransom value, survival depended on mercy, luck, or the kindness of nearby villagers who sometimes wandered onto the field looking for loved ones and ended up helping strangers instead. But kindness competed with fear. A wounded enemy could lash out in panic, mistake rescuers for assailants, or try to flee. No one wanted to get stabbed by someone halfway to the grave. So hesitation was natural. As daylight faded, the desperate energy intensified. Wounded men who'd been patient suddenly panicked, aware of what nightfall meant. Some crawled with renewed determination, dragging broken limbs across the ground at a painful, heartbreaking pace. Others shouted hoarsely until their voices cracked. Some prayed, some cursed. A few, in moments of dark humour, tried bargaining with the universe itself. If I live, I promise to be a better man, or at least a cleaner one. But promises didn't stop bleeding, and there was no anaesthesia, unless you counted passing out from fear. For every soldier rescued, several were not. The battlefield's terrible quiet returned as exhaustion overcame human voices, leaving the wounded lying in scattered clusters, waiting for dawn or rescue, or whatever fate medieval medicine had in store for them. If being wounded on the battlefield was a nightmare, then arriving at medieval field surgery was the sequel nobody wanted. Soldiers dragged or carried into the surgeon's tent entered a world where the difference between treatment and torture was mostly intent. The air was thick with the smell of blood, iron, boiled wine, sweat, and the deep philosophical despair of men realizing medieval medicine was about to get very personal. Instruments clattered, assistants shouted for more cloth or water, and somewhere in the background, a patient screamed with such enthusiasm that newcomers immediately reconsidered whether crawling away into the woods might be the better option. Field surgeons were not the soft-handed healers of later centuries. They were craftsmen, half doctor, half blacksmith, all determination. Their workspace looked less like a hospital and more like an improvised workshop. Saws, knives, hooks, needles, thread, boiling pots, ladles of wine, and buckets of water that were changed only when someone remembered they probably should. Your surgeon had 3 qualifications: a knife and strong arms and optimism. The first step in the surgical process was assessment, which meant poking the wound to see how bad it was. This was done without warning because asking for permission wasted time and bravery. If the wound was shallow, the surgeon cleaned it with wine, which was both disinfectant and emotional support, applied a poultice and stitched it shut. But if the wound was deep, ragged, or contained pieces of someone else's weapon, the surgeon sighed, sharpened something ominous, and muttered, "This is going to be unpleasant for all of us." Arrow wounds were particularly annoying. Arrows came in different shapes, barbed, hooked, broad-headed, and removing them was an art form bordering on torture. The worst were barbed arrows, which tore everything on the way out. Surgeons sometimes pushed the arrow through the body to remove it cleanly from the other side, a method that made grown men scream in multiple languages. If pushing through didn't work, they used a tool called a crown extractor. Imagine a tiny medieval corkscrew for your insides. When even that failed, the surgeon simply widened the wound with a knife until the arrow surrendered out of sheer respect. But nothing struck fear like the word amputation. Losing a limb was often the only way to prevent infection from killing a soldier outright. And since no one had anaesthesia, unless they counted passing out blessing wine or biting down very hard, Amputations were grisly affairs powered by speed. The surgeon's goal was to remove the limb as quickly as possible. The patient's goal was to not die of shock. Assistants held the soldier down while the surgeon cut through flesh, muscle, and tendon with practiced efficiency. The sound alone was something men remembered for life, or tried very hard to forget. Then came the bone. Sawdust wasn't an official part of the process, but enough limbs were sawn that the term became symbolic. Surgeons used heavy iron saws, and the rasping rhythm echoed through the tent like a carpenter building a very disturbing piece of furniture. Some patients screamed, others fainted, which honestly improved the experience for everyone involved. Once the limb was off, the surgeon applied a hot iron to cauterize the wound. This both stopped bleeding and ensured the patient would never again underestimate the value of cooling breezes. Cauterization had other uses too. It closed arteries, sterilized ragged wounds, and provided a deeply unpleasant sensation that reminded soldiers they were still alive. Heated iron, boiling oil, burning cloth, whatever worked was used. Medical accuracy was secondary to survival, and since infection was the greatest killer in medieval warfare, cauterization was the closest thing they had to a miracle, albeit a fiery one that smelled like regret. The battlefield hospital, if one could even call it that, was usually a large tent or an open-air area covered with cloths to create shade. Cleanliness was subjective. Surgeons rinsed tools in water, wine, or wiped them on their aprons, which held the stains of at least 10 previous patients and several questionable lunches. Assistants prepared bandages from torn shirts, spare linens, or anything absorbent that wasn't still on fire. The constant flow of wounded meant there was no time to rest. Surgeons stopped only when their hands shook too much to hold the knife, or when there were no more patients left alive to treat. Not everything was brutality. Some surgeons were genuinely brilliant. They learned which wounds healed well, which herbs reduced swelling, which stitching patterns held best, and how to improvise splints from shields, tent poles, or discarded spear shafts. A few even specialised in cosmetic wound closure, ensuring that nobles had scars dramatic enough to brag about without terrifying court dinner guests. Still, even the most skilled surgeon couldn't escape the limitations of the era. Infection lurked in every corner. Soldiers might survive surgery only to die days later when fever set in. Others recovered with permanent disabilities, missing limbs, or newly acquired fear of anything sharp. Yet for all its brutality, medieval field surgery was astonishingly effective at times. Many soldiers survived wounds modern people assume would be fatal. Bones healed, muscles mended. Men returned to battle wearing their scars like badges of experience, some even boasting about how many times they'd survived the surgeon's tent. The battle might have ended, but for many medieval soldiers the real work and the real payday was only beginning. Looting wasn't a shameful secret, it was an accepted, expected, and often enthusiastically encouraged part of warfare. Commanders tolerated it, soldiers relied on it, and the dead, well, they weren't in a position to file complaints. Armour, weapons, boots, belts, purses, rings, knives, drinking flasks. If it could be carried, it was carried. If it couldn't be carried, soldiers suddenly discovered they possessed incredible upper body strength. In a world where pay was uncertain and food was inconsistent, the battlefield was a marketplace with no vendor supervision. If you didn't want your stuff stolen, you should have won. Sorry, those are just the rules. As the dust settled, soldiers moved across the field like determined bargain hunters at a very violent outdoor market. The dead were rolled over, patted down, inspected, and relieved of anything that glinted. Armour was the ultimate prize. It was expensive, time-consuming to make, and a soldier could sell it or wear it depending on whether he valued money or basic bodily protection. Removing it, however, was a task that required patience and a strong stomach. Medieval armour strapped, buckled, laced, and clung stubbornly to its owner like a loyal pet refusing to be separated. Soldiers wrestled with the limbs of the deceased, muttering curses as they tugged off greaves and gauntlets that seemed determined to remain on duty. Boots were another treasure. Good boots could outlast years of marching, and a soldier with well-fitted footwear already had an advantage over half his peers. This meant looters were often seen dragging corpses by the ankles, as if hoping momentum alone would yank the boots free. If the boots did come off easily, it meant the owner had probably not survived long enough to scuff them. If they didn't come off easily, someone might simply cut them off and deal with stitching later. Weapons were snatched up quickly. Swords, axes, maces, daggers. A soldier might leave home with a basic spear, but return with a deluxe collection of equipment that absolutely did not belong to him 3 hours earlier. Even broken weapon had value. The metal could be reforged and the hilts reused. Shields were inspected for coats of arms, not out of respect, but because noble heraldry made them more expensive to sell. A dented shield with a fancy symbol was worth far more than a perfectly intact one with no decoration. Coins were, naturally, the fastest to vanish. Pouches were cut, pockets searched, belts ripped open. Some soldiers became experts at identifying the telltale bulge of a coin purse even under layers of armour. Others developed an ear for the soft clink of metal as they rolled a body over. While the dead were the easiest to loot, the not quite dead presented opportunities with complications. A wounded man who was conscious might try negotiating, "If you help me, I'll reward you," which truly inspired the looter, because they could take the reward now and skip the helping part entirely. Some wounded men tried playing dead, lying still and praying the looter passed over them. But soldiers were experienced in the art of verifying death. A poke, a kick, or a casual nudge with a spear was standard procedure. Some looters placed a hand under a man's nose. If they felt warm breath, they considered it either a mercy moment or a problem to solve. Others simply asked, "Are you dead?" and reacted accordingly, because nothing in medieval warfare was known for its subtlety. Checking if someone was faking dead became part of the looting ritual. A suspiciously relaxed hand might be alive, a body positioned too neatly, probably alive. A man holding his breath so hard his face turned red, definitely alive, and also not very good at pretending. The bravest or most desperate wounded men reached up to grab a looter's hand or garment, hoping to appeal to pity or humanity. Unfortunately, this often frightened the looter so much that pity evaporated and survival instincts kicked in. Being grabbed by an unexpected hand on a battlefield was something few men handled gracefully. Despite its grimness, looting had its own strange etiquette. Soldiers avoided stripping noble bodies too casually. Taking the armour of a lord was allowed, but taking his jewellery sometimes caused political headaches. Religious items could be taken, but only if they were useful. A cross worn around the neck might stay untouched out of piety, unless it was made of gold, in which case piety suddenly became very flexible. Camp followers also joined the scavenging. Women who travelled with the army, craftsmen, cooks, merchants, all of them combed through the leftovers. They gathered clothing, blankets, small tools, leftover food, and anything that could be repurposed or sold. Some retrieved the belongings of loved ones, hoping to provide closure to families back home. Others simply needed resources to survive. And through it all, soldiers justified their actions with simple logic. Looting was part of their pay structure. War was expensive, supplies were limited. If the king couldn't afford to pay them properly, and he often couldn't, then the fallen became involuntary contributors to the military budget. Looting was messy, brutal, and deeply human. It blurred lines between necessity and greed, survival and opportunism. A man might collect a dead enemy's helmet with the same earnestness another man used to gather a family heirloom. The battlefield was a place where death equalized everyone, and where the living, driven by hunger, desperation, or simple pragmatism, took what they needed to keep on living. When the looters finished their rounds and the dust had fully settled, the battlefield entered its darkest phase, the quiet, grim work of deciding who among the injured would live, who could be saved, and who was simply too far gone. This was the part of medieval warfare no one sang songs about. Bards didn't strum lutes to celebrate that guy with the small knife who walked around making terrible decisions. Yet this task fell to soldiers constantly. and they performed it with a mixture of resignation, practicality, fear, and occasionally a flicker of compassion. Congratulations, you survived the battle. Now survive this guy. The small knife was the most important tool of this phase. Almost every soldier carried one. A simple, sharp blade, easy to maneuver, quick to draw, and deadly in close quarters. It was used to cut straps, slice cloth, pry out splinters, and, when necessary, end the suffering of men lying broken in the mud. It was the quietest tool on the battlefield, which made it feel more intimate than any sword or axe. A man who used it didn't stand yards away swinging. He knelt beside someone, close enough to hear their breathing or their begging. It is no wonder chroniclers spoke of this work in hushed tones. Not all finishing was mercy. Sometimes it was fear. The wounded, even on the brink of death, could be dangerous. A man clutching a dagger with his last ounce of strength could kill the looter who leaned too close. Others could shout warnings, revealing positions or calling reinforcements. Some simply frightened the superstitious. Soldiers already jittery from hours of combat did not relish walking past bodies that groaned or twitched unexpectedly. Many preferred the practical solution. Remove the risk. This blunt logic shaped countless battlefield decisions, but there were genuine mercy killings too. Moments when soldiers recognized suffering too immense to mend. A man gut shot, a man whose limbs had been mangled beyond repair, a man burning with fever from filthy wounds. For these cases, a quick end was seen not as cruelty, but as a final kindness. Medieval religion was deeply tied to these choices. Some soldiers whispered prayers before acting. Others offered last rites if no priest was in sight. A dying man might ask for it, voice shaking, breath shallow, eyes hollow. And though later stories tried to gloss over these tragedies, survivors sometimes admitted that mercy weighed heavier on the heart than killing in battle ever did. Ransom added yet another layer of complexity. Noble warriors were too valuable to kill outright, even when wounded. A knight with a crushed leg might still be worth a small fortune if captured alive. So soldiers moved across the field like grim accountants, mentally sorting bodies into categories. Dead, dying, too poor to bother, and might pay for my retirement. A wounded noble might be hauled off the field with surprising gentleness of his armour, and heraldry, he suggested money. Suddenly, compassion bloomed, though not out of kindness but out of economic opportunity. Hostage-taking worked similarly for non-nobles, though on a less glamorous scale. Towns sometimes ransomed back their missing militiamen. Wealthy families occasionally paid to ensure their sons weren't left to perish. And even if ransom was never collected, having a hostage gave the captor bargaining power later. Soldiers who recognized this became adept at identifying wounded foes who looked the least likely to die on the way home. Then there were the dishonourable killings, the ugliest part of this shadowy work. Sometimes soldiers ended lives not out of mercy, fear, or profit, but simply because the wounded belonged to the enemy. Hatred ran deep after hours of brutal combat. Bloodshed warped judgment, and the chaos created moments where vengeance became an easy path. If a battlefield was remote or the army exhausted, discipline might slip, and the line between mercy and murder blurred until no one could remember which was which. This grim labour wasn't always carried out by the same men. Some soldiers avoided it entirely, shuddering at the thought. Others were unofficially designated because they were either the most emotionally detached or the most unsettlingly efficient. These men walked across the battlefield with calm purpose, moving from body to body, their small knives glinting faintly as the sun sank lower. They were respected, feared, or quietly avoided, even by their own comrades. Occasionally misunderstandings turned this work into awkward comedy of the bleakest variety. A soldier leaning down to finish a foe might be startled when the corpse suddenly sat up and shouted something defiant or nonsensical. Another soldier attempting to check if someone was still breathing might poke the man a bit too forcefully and trigger a reflex punch. There were even rare cases of soldiers prematurely declaring someone finished, only for the victim to groan back to life hours later, astonishing everyone involved. The act of finishing off the wounded also created a strange space where human tenderness and brutality intertwined. A soldier might offer water to one man, end the suffering of another, ransom a third and kill a fourth out of fear, all in the same hour. Medieval battlefields were places where morality stretched, twisted, and sometimes snapped under the weight of practical necessity. When dawn finally rose on the field after this grim work, the landscape looked eerily peaceful, still bodies lying in positions shaped by last-second instincts, warriors slumped beside enemies, and the silent imprint of choices made under moonlight. Those who performed the finishing work rarely spoke of it. It was the part of war everyone knew existed, but hoped someone else would handle. Long before medieval men dreamed of winning fortunes through alchemy, buried treasure, or marrying into a family with suspiciously frail elders, they knew one truth. The real jackpot was capturing a noble on the battlefield. Ransom wasn't a side effect of war, it was an entire economy, a profit system so widespread and accepted that soldiers marched into battle half hoping to snag a wealthy hostage rather than swing a sword heroically. If you caught a noble alive, you basically won the medieval lottery, minus the part where he hates you. Capturing prisoners began the moment an enemy threw down his weapon and shouted surrender loud enough for witnesses to hear. Surrender was a performance, complete with raised hands, wide eyes, and a posture that screamed, "Please don't stab me. I am financially useful." For nobles, this surrender came with etiquette. A knight was expected to yield gracefully, offering his name, rank, and a quick summary of his family's bank account. The captor, in turn, was expected to accept this surrender without sticking him in the liver, a small courtesy but appreciated. Once the surrender was acknowledged, a strange ceremony followed. The captive handed over his sword, not forcibly pried away, not ripped from his hands, handed over hilt first as a mark of trust. The victor accepted it with solemn dignity, even though internally he might be thinking, yeah, this thing is worth more than my horse, my armour, and my house combined. Identifying someone's ransom value became a skill soldiers cultivated with surprising enthusiasm. Recognizing noble heraldry was essential. A man wearing beautifully crafted armour with gold inlay, fine silk undershirts, and a helmet so fancy it could have hosted its own royal banquet. Now that was someone you didn't kill. Common soldiers, meanwhile, had the unfortunate habit of looking very much like other common soldiers. Their capture still had uses, labour, leverage, or political messaging, but they weren't going to pay for your children's future or build you a new barn. The etiquette of capturing someone who outranked you could be awkward. Imagine a muddy foot soldier standing over a fallen duke, whose armour cost more than the soldier's entire village. There was an unspoken rule: don't embarrass him. Nobility valued dignity like modern influencers value lighting. A captured noble expected to be treated with respect, which meant not dragging him by the ankles or rifling through his pockets too enthusiastically. The captor could take the noble's sword, shield, and maybe an expensive belt buckle, but stripping him on the spot was considered extremely rude. This was delayed until later, preferably in private, where the noble could pretend he had undressed voluntarily. Hostage-taking also worked on hierarchy. If a knight captured a baron, that baron was technically in the knight's custody, but socially it was like a chicken capturing a fox. So the knight quickly transferred the prisoner to someone of appropriate rank, often for a cut of the ransom. This led to lively negotiations. "I'll give you this marquis for 20 silver and first pick of his boots. 10 silver and you get the boots only if they fit. Deal." Marching prisoners off the battlefield required care. Captives walked between guards who were instructed not to injure them unnecessarily. After all, a damaged product sells for less. Some captives were bound, others merely escorted, depending on rank. A noble who gave his word not to flee was often trusted because breaking his promise risked eternal shame or worse, social ostracism from people who spent their lives inventing new ways to judge each other. But not all prisoners walked willingly. Some feigned cooperation, waiting for a moment of distraction before bolting, only to discover that running in chainmail was less dramatic escape and more slow-motion regret. Others begged, bribed or pleaded, offering jewels, favours or family secrets in exchange for freedom. Soldiers listened politely, took notes, and then marched them to camp anyway. Prisoners were worth more alive. Once in camp, noble prisoners were kept under watch, but often lived surprisingly comfortably. They were given tents, beds, decent meals, and even wine if they were lucky. Their captors wanted them healthy, presentable, and terrified enough to cooperate. Hostage life could be strange, half imprisonment, half forced vacation. Some nobles developed friendships or rivalries with their captors. Others sulked dramatically, insisting on reminding everyone how unthinkably rude this whole process was. Ransoms were arranged through letters carried back home by trusted messengers. The captive dictated the letter, emphasizing both his survival and the urgency of payment. Families negotiated amounts, kings intervened, and accountants groaned. A ransom might include gold, land, political favours, or, in rare cases, trading another hostage of equal value. Entire careers were built on managing these transactions. Common prisoners had a less glamorous fate. Some were used as labourers, digging trenches, repairing walls, carrying equipment. Others were traded back in groups during peace talks. A few were simply conscripted into the victor's army, their allegiance shifting with the winds, or with whoever fed them next. For them, captivity was less economic opportunity and more extended unpleasant inconvenience. The ransom system influenced everything. It altered tactics. Soldiers avoided killing nobles when possible. It affected morale. A captured leader was a political earthquake. It fueled greed, ambition, and unexpected bursts of mercy. Behind every clash of swords lurked a quiet hope. Maybe, just maybe, today's enemy would be tomorrow's payday. If soldiers thought the battlefield emptied once the fighting stopped, they were wrong. As soon as armies pulled back, sometimes before the last groan faded into the air, a different crowd surged in, moving with the enthusiasm of shoppers racing toward a sale. No one advertised, but everyone understood. These were the scavengers. Beggars, camp followers, washerwomen, gravediggers, relic hunters, wandering merchants, and local peasants armed with baskets, bags, and a kind of practical optimism only desperation could produce. One man's battlefield horror was another man's thrift store. Camp followers were usually the first wave. They moved with speed and purpose, not because they were fearless, but because they had done this many times before. These women and men, cooks, water carriers, tailors, smiths, and family members of soldiers knew exactly what they were looking for and how fast they had to work. They darted between bodies, scooping up belts, canteens, cloaks, knives, and anything too mundane for soldiers to bother with. A cloak left behind by a rider was, to a camp follower, free insulation for winter, a dented helmet, a mixing bowl for tonight's stew. A bent spear shaft, perfect firewood. Their motto might as well have been, "If it's not nailed down, it's coming with us." Behind them came the beggars and the poorest villagers from nearby settlements. These people arrived cautiously at first, peering over hedges or from behind trees. Once they were sure the soldiers were gone and not about to shout, "Hey, that's ours," they crept onto the field. Their search was not just opportunistic but essential. A single pair of boots could mean warmth for a child. A chunk of chainmail could be sold for enough grain to feed a family. Even scraps of cloth were valuable when every thread counted. Some villagers scavenged with grim determination, their faces set in the hard focus of people who had endured too many hungry seasons. Others whispered prayers as they moved, fearing spirits were watching or that the dead might resent being disturbed. A few, driven by superstition, avoided touching bodies altogether and instead hunted for arrows, broken shields, or fallen banners, anything that carried less emotional weight and fewer unpleasant surprises. Merchants were a different breed entirely. These were the battlefield entrepreneurs, wandering tradesmen who seemed to appear out of thin air the moment the last sword clattered to the ground. They inspected armour like jewellers evaluating gemstones, noting dents, rust spots, and craftsmanship. They gathered weapons to resell, fabrics to repurpose, and metal pieces for melting down. Some even carried small carts or pack animals to transport their finds. For them, war was terrible, but also terribly profitable. They were the only people who could look at a heap of shattered shields and genuinely smile. Gravediggers also arrived early. Many were hired by local lords or religious houses, while others simply took work wherever they could find it. They carried shovels, pickaxes, and a weary resignation that suggested they had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. Their job was huge and horrible, digging the enormous pits that would hold dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies. Before they could begin, they helped drag corpses into clusters, sort them by allegiance when possible, and remove whatever equipment was left that could still be reused. Efficient? Yes. Morbid? Also yes. Among the strangest arrivals were the relic hunters. These individuals were part archaeologist, part treasure seeker, and part spiritual enthusiast. They combed the battlefield for objects touched by death and bravery. Broken swords, saint medallions found in the mud, splinters of shields. Some were church officials gathering items to sanctify or display. Others were frauds planning to sell holy relics to unsuspecting pilgrims later. A piece of plain iron could become a nail from the armour of Blessed Geoffrey, who died bravely, even if Geoffrey was actually a farmer from 2 villages over who'd never blessed anything in his life. But perhaps the most relatable scavengers were the locals simply trying to find anything useful that wouldn't get them in trouble. Peasants searched for intact clothing, empty purses, abandoned horses, and intact weapons. A sword found on the battlefield could become a prized heirloom, a tool, or even a protective charm. Because when you lived in a world where law enforcement was scarce, owning a sharp object was a kind of insurance policy. Armour pieces were prized not to wear, but to melt down for nails, hinges, or farm tools. Even broken arrows could be repurposed as thatching nails or skewers. What tied all these people together was necessity. To soldiers, the battlefield was a place of fear and violence. To scavengers, it was a temporary storehouse overflowing with things too valuable to leave behind. And while their work might seem grim, it also served a practical purpose. They cleared the field of useful materials long before rot or rain ruined them. In a way, scavengers were an unofficial cleanup crew, one motivated by survival rather than civic duty. This chaotic rush created strange scenes. A beggar might tug on one end of a cloak while a merchant tugged on the other. A washerwoman might scold a relic hunter for stepping on her laundry pile. A peasant hauling a dented shield might trip over a gravedigger's shovel. Awkward moments abounded, but everyone understood the unwritten rules. Move fast, don't steal from each other unless you can run faster, and absolutely avoid touching anything that was still breathing. By the time soldiers returned or officers sent patrols to secure the field, the scavengers were often long gone, leaving behind a cleaner, emptier, and eerily quiet landscape. Their disappearance was swift, almost ghost-like, ensuring no one could point fingers or accuse them of wrongdoing. They knew timing was everything. Arrive too early and you risk getting trampled by retreating cavalry. Arrive too late, and all that's left are regrets and flies. Long before the last soldier limped away, the battlefield began to attract an entirely different set of visitors. Creatures who neither cared who won nor understood why humans kept insisting on hitting each other with metal. For these animals, the aftermath of combat was an irresistible invitation. Nature, after all, wastes nothing. And medieval chroniclers, who were dramatic even on their calmest days, insisted that animals arrived with uncanny speed. Some claim the crows were circling before the first sword was drawn, as if they had a subscription to upcoming local events. The good news? You avoided swords. The bad news? The pigs did not avoid you. Crows were always the first to arrive. They perched on fallen branches, shield rims, and broken spear shafts with the confidence of regular customers who knew the staff personally. Their black capaces contrasted starkly with the churned earth, and their cawing echoed across the field like a dark commentary track. Soldiers half believed these birds followed armies from town to town, memorizing routes the way merchants memorized market days. Crows had sharp eyes, sharper beaks, and absolutely no respect for personal space, especially if the person in question was unconscious or recently deceased. Chroniclers described them tearing open purses, tugging at loose clothing, and hopping boldly onto bodies as if inspecting merchandise. Wolves came next, but cautiously. Medieval Europe had no shortage of them, and a battlefield was an irresistible opportunity. But wolves, unlike crows, valued strategy. They approached warily, sniffing the air, watching for movement, waiting for the living to finish their strange rituals before claiming what remained. Travellers' tales often transformed wolves into supernatural omens, ghostly beasts emerging from mist, eyes glowing, jaws dripping, but far more often they were practical animals searching for an easy meal. In truth, wolves preferred to scavenge rather than fight. A battlefield gave them abundance with minimal risk, though they were smart enough to avoid anything still twitching or shouting insults. Dogs, on the other hand, behaved unpredictably. Many belonged to the armies themselves, hunting hounds, guard dogs, companions to officers or common soldiers. When battles ended, these loyal animals searched desperately for their masters, weaving through the carnage with heartbreaking confusion. Some found their owners and lay beside them whining softly. Others became protectors, barking fiercely at anyone who approached the bodies they guarded. And then there were stray or roaming dogs from nearby villages who arrived later, drawn by the same grim attraction as the wolves. These dogs were bolder, hungrier, and less sentimental, though even they sometimes displayed odd bursts of loyalty, defending wounded men who had once tossed them scraps. But the most unsettling battlefield visitors, according to medieval sources, were pigs. Yes, pigs, not the charming curly-tailed creatures that modern cartoons have convinced us are adorable. Medieval pigs were tough, semi-wild, opportunistic animals with jaws strong enough to crack bones. They roamed freely, especially in rural regions where forests doubled as communal grazing grounds. And when they wandered onto a battlefield, things got memorable. Chroniclers described pigs as fearless, shameless, and disturbingly enthusiastic. They rooted through piles of broken equipment, sniffed bodies with investigative snorts, and occasionally nudged wounded soldiers, causing more than one man to think he was being attacked by demons. Some accounts claimed pigs developed a taste for human flesh. Others insisted they preferred edible scraps and discarded rations. Regardless, their presence deeply disturbed medieval observers who already believed pigs were suspicious creatures capable of devouring anything not nailed down. A battlefield full of corpses? That was practically a buffet. Even stranger were the moments when pigs startled armed men. More than one soldier, returning to search for friends or equipment, swore he was charged by a determined hog protecting whatever it had decided was now its property. A hog with momentum is not something any human wants to negotiate with, especially not on uneven ground while wearing heavy boots. Thus the stories of battlefield pigs took on almost mythical weight, tiny pink demons roaming the aftermath of war, sent by fate to remind humans of their own foolishness. Other animals made appearances too. Foxes darted in and out, stealing scraps of leather or cloth for their dens. Hawks and kites soared overhead, drawn by movement. Rats scurried enthusiastically through the remains of camps abandoned in haste. Even domestic animals, cows, goats, wandering sheep, sometimes wandered into the chaos, nibbling at trampled grass or staring blankly at the destruction, as if wondering why humans insisted on complicating everything. The presence of these creatures added a surreal atmosphere to the post-battle landscape. Soldiers returning to search the field might find crows perched solemnly atop helmets, dogs lying protectively beside the fallen, pigs trotting among the debris as if conducting their own inspections, and wolves watching from the tree line. Nature was reclaiming the field quickly, efficiently, and without sentiment. To medieval minds, this mingling of animals and death had symbolic meaning. Crows and wolves were messengers of doom. Dogs were guardians of souls. Pigs were reminders that chaos didn't discriminate. Some men believed animals arrived to escort the dead to the next world. Others believed they came to feed on human folly. Many simply accepted that war did not end when soldiers sheathed their blades. It continued as nature quietly cleaned up after them. And while soldiers feared enemy armies, there was something uniquely humbling about walking through a field where pigs had already begun their unsettling patrols. It reminded everyone, noble or foot soldier, victor or vanquished, that death erased all distinctions and that the world moved on with or without human permission. If daytime on a battlefield was chaos, nighttime was terror wearing a darker cloak. When the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows pulled across the churned earth, the field transformed from a place of violence to a landscape of dread. Soldiers hated fighting in the dark, but they feared surviving into the night even more. Congratulations, you survived the day. Now try not to get eaten. As the last light slipped away, the battlefield's remaining warmth vanished with it. The ground, soaked with blood and water, released a chill that cut deeper than any blade. Wounded men who had held on to hope suddenly felt the cold creeping into their bones, tightening around them like an unwelcome embrace. Trembling hands reached for discarded cloaks or pieces of cloth, anything to create a barrier against the night air. Those who were too injured to move simply curled into themselves, praying that dawn, or rescue, would come before the cold claimed them. But the darkness brought more than cold. It brought confusion. Shapes became indistinct. Fallen weapons and bodies blurred into one sprawling mass. Men who tried to crawl to safety found themselves circling back to where they started. Some crawled toward torchlight, only to discover it belonged to the wrong camp. Others feared moving at all, terrified they would stumble upon an enemy soldier equally terrified and equally on edge. A battlefield at night was not a place for bravery. It was a place for not dying in stupid ways. Sounds shifted too. In daylight, battlefields were loud with shouts and clashing metal. At night, the silence was punctuated only by groans, rustling fabric, distant animal calls, and the occasional thud of a scavenger stepping on something less solid than intended. These noises wormed their way into exhausted minds, turning every distant crack into the imagined step of an enemy, every rustle into a predator stalking through the corpses. Hallucinations sparked easily in men who had already spent hours drenched in adrenaline and fear. Some swore they saw ghostly figures wandering the field. Others believed they heard voices calling their names. A few muttered prayers to saints they hadn't remembered earlier, hoping divine intervention worked overtime shifts. And then there were the looters who preferred working under cover of darkness. These weren't the camp followers or peasants who rushed in earlier. They were bolder, stealthier, and often armed. They moved quietly across the field, searching for valuables missed during the day. Their presence added a new layer of danger. A wounded man who cried out might attract help, or attract someone who saw him as an inconvenient obstacle. Men pretended to be dead in hopes these nocturnal visitors would pass them by, lying still even as boots crunched beside their heads. Predators, emboldened by darkness, ventured closer too. Wolves that lingered at the tree line during daylight now padded silently among the fallen. Their eyes glimmered under the moonlight as they sniffed out opportunities. They were cautious, not foolish enough to challenge armed men, but the wounded, the dying and the isolated were fair game. Dogs, both stray and abandoned military animals, roamed the field as well, forming temporary packs with their own uneasy rules. To the desperate or delirious wounded, the sound of soft paws or low growls in the darkness was enough to send fear spiralling into panic. Enemy stragglers added another complication. Not all fighting forces retreated cleanly. Some soldiers, injured, lost, or unwilling to face their commanders, wandered the battlefield long after combat ended. These men were unpredictable, hungry, frightened, and uncertain of who still lived. They lashed out at anything that startled them. A groan in the darkness might be mistaken for a threat. A shadow might be struck before anyone could speak. Night turned the battlefield into a place where friend and foe were indistinguishable shapes, and survival depended on silence and stillness. Even the flames offered little comfort. Campfires flickered in the distance near encampments, casting strange dancing shadows that distorted perception even further. Torches carried by patrolling officers created brief windows of clarity, but as soon as the light passed, the darkness seemed deeper than before. Men who had crawled toward these lights in hopes of rescue sometimes froze when they realized the people carrying them did not speak their language. The wounded faced a unique torment. Infection set in quickly, fever rose, thirst gnawed at the throat. Some men called for water, their voices cracking. Others whispered for their mothers, wives, or God. The night amplified these quiet pleas, scattering them across the field like haunting echoes. Those trying to sleep found their rest broken by shouts, moans, or the sudden cry of someone realizing too late that something was pulling at their boot. Yet amidst all this, strange moments of humanity appeared. Soldiers from opposing sides occasionally met in the dark, both lost and disoriented. Sometimes they fought, sometimes realizing neither had the strength for another blow, they simply backed away or gestured vaguely towards safer ground. Rarely, very rarely, a wounded soldier was helped by an enemy who could not bring himself to walk past suffering. In the darkness, chivalry flickered like a candle struggling to stay lit. Nightfall was not just frightening, it was deeply disorienting. It forced soldiers to confront the vulnerabilities they had ignored during battle. There was no armour against the cold, no shield against fever, no helmet thick enough to stop the imagination from conjuring horrors. Dawn became a distant dream, a faint promise of clarity and warmth. Those who survived the night emerged changed, hollow-eyed and shaken, as if they had fought a second invisible battle. When dawn finally crept over the battlefield, it revealed a landscape frozen in the aftermath of violence, a place where thousands of stories had ended abruptly and now needed to be sorted, named, moved, or mourned. The living, exhausted and hollow-eyed, returned to begin one of the hardest tasks of all, deciding who these bodies were, where they belonged, and how to lay them to rest with whatever dignity could be salvaged. It was slow, heartbreaking, unpleasant work, and yet as necessary as any battle strategy. Your family might never find your body, but they'd absolutely find your outstanding debts. Identifying the dead was far from straightforward. Armour-disguised faces, blood-obscured features, and wounds distorted once familiar forms. Soldiers who had fought shoulder to shoulder struggled to recognize comrades whose helmets were missing, whose clothes had been stripped away by looters. The first step was often simply turning bodies over, searching for anything distinctive: tattoos, scars, rings, family tokens worn beneath armour. A noble might have a signet ring or embroidered garment that revealed lineage. Common soldiers had fewer markers, leaving friends to piece together identity by memory alone. I think this is Edmund, but Edmund never lay that still. Commanders dispatched men to locate high-ranking dead first. Nobles were too politically valuable to remain on a field where wolves, pigs, or time might erase them. Their bodies were retrieved with haste and ideally care. Some were placed on shields and borne away by grim-faced retainers. Others were wrapped in cloaks and carried toward waiting wagons. These recoveries could spark brief fierce struggles when opposing armies claimed the same corpse, both wishing to boast of killing him, or to avoid the accusation of failing to protect him. Common soldiers, however, did not receive such individualized attention. Their remains were gathered in groups, moved by dragging, carrying, or loading onto carts. The battlefield filled with the sound of weary grunting as teams worked methodically across the terrain. The living stepped carefully, the ground far too uneven to risk falling, an indignity no one wanted. Once the bodies were sorted and collected, burial sites had to be prepared. Mass graves were the norm, not from cruelty but from necessity. There were simply too many dead for individual funerals, and the longer the bodies remained unburied, the greater the dangers. Disease, scavengers, demoralization, and the mounting stench that clung to clothing and hair long after one left the field. Digging these trenches required immense labour. Gravediggers and soldiers alike swung shovels into the damp earth, forming long pits deep enough to hold dozens, sometimes hundreds of corpses. The work was physically brutal. Blisters formed within minutes, and mud stuck to boots until each step felt like lifting a sack of stones. Lime often played a role in these burials. Buckets of quicklime were sprinkled over the bodies to help speed decomposition and reduce the smell. It was not a gentle substance. When mixed with moisture, including the natural moisture of the battlefield, it produced heat. It seemed unnatural, even eerie, to soldiers watching the pale powder hiss faintly atop the dead. Many whispered that lime was alchemy, sorcery, or a cleansing fire granted by heaven. In truth, it was simply chemistry doing its harsh work. Sometimes the graves were trenches, sometimes they were pits, sometimes, when the army was in a hurry or digging was impossible due to hard ground, bodies were covered with stones or even burned, though large-scale burning was rare and difficult to manage. Burial was not just practical, it was psychological. A cleared field helped the living move on. Leaving bodies exposed risked demoralizing troops, offending religious sensibilities, or inviting accusations of sacrilege. In cases where the battlefield remained contested or armies marched away quickly, local villagers were left with the grim duty of finishing the job. These civilians walked the field with cloths held over their noses, murmuring prayers as they gathered remains into carts. Families came searching too, mothers, wives, siblings wandering through carnage, scanning faces, hoping against hope to find someone alive. Many left without answers. Medieval records are full of names marked missing, a euphemism meaning the body was never found or found too late to identify. Some bodies were claimed by the religious orders. Monks travelled to battlefields determined to bless and bury as many fallen souls as they could. They recited prayers over pits, sprinkled holy water, and tried to bring sacred order to a place that had been ruled by chaos. A few monasteries even built ossuaries, bone houses, using skulls and femurs gathered from battlefields long after the flesh had disappeared. These collections became haunting reminders of the cost of war. But sorting the dead wasn't always respectful or solemn. Amid the practical labour, men sometimes cracked jokes, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. Humour preserves sanity. A soldier hauling a corpse over his shoulder might mutter something about carrying Ralph one last time, and someone else would laugh because the alternative was breaking down entirely. This morbid camaraderie helped them endure the unbearable. And yet, there were moments of profound tenderness. A man finding his friend would kneel beside him, straighten his clothing, or whisper a farewell. Someone might place a small token on the body, a coin, a scrap of ribbon, a piece of bread as a gesture of memory. The field, so loud with violence only a day earlier, became a quiet place of reflection. When the burial was finished, the earth packed flat and marked by little more than disturbed soil, the armies finally moved on. The battlefield, now stripped of its immediate horror, began to fade into the background of the landscape. Grass would return, animals would forget, trees would grow, and the names of many who fell there would vanish too, surviving only in the vague recollections of survivors and the debts they left behind. Long before tourists collected keychains or magnets, medieval warriors collected something far more disturbing: pieces of the people they'd defeated, banners ripped from enemy ranks, weapons taken from fallen foes, and, on more unsettling occasions, body parts that absolutely no one wanted to see hanging above the fireplace. Nothing says I won like carrying home something that makes dinner awkward. Trophy-taking wasn't a medieval quirk, it was an ancient and widespread practice. For many warriors, a trophy was proof of bravery, a way to confirm to skeptics back home that yes, they had in fact faced danger head-on and lived to tell the tale. In an era without photographs or social media, authenticity required something more tangible. A sword inscribed with a foreign crest or a shield bearing scars from an enemy's last desperate strike spoke volumes about one's courage. and if those weren't dramatic enough, there was always the option of taking a head. Head-taking was shockingly common. In certain cultures, a severed head was the highest military receipt one could present. It served simultaneously as currency, proof, intimidation, and morbid decoration. Heads were stacked, displayed, or paraded, depending on local custom. The process was messy, but warriors believed it captured honour, or at least fear, far better than any written report. For some armies, a soldier's pay or promotion depended on the number of enemy heads he could present to his commander. This created complicated moral dilemmas and even more complicated arithmetic. Ears were a popular alternative for the squeamish, or for those who didn't want to carry excessive weight. Easier to remove, easier to store, and less likely to startle your horse. Ears became the portable trophy of choice in many conflicts. Soldiers tied them in strings, slipped them into pouches, or stitched them into grim necklaces. It was shocking, grotesque, and surprisingly efficient. A single soldier might carry proof of 20 or 30 kills in a bundle small enough to fit in his pocket. Medieval sources, never subtle, sometimes mention soldiers boasting of their collection like modern people boast about rare coins. If bodily trophies brought fear, banners brought prestige. Capturing an enemy's banner was the medieval equivalent of stealing their national identity, their pride and their bragging rights all at once. A banner wasn't just cloth, it symbolized the soul of the army. When it fell into enemy hands, morale crumbled. Commanders displayed captured banners in their halls, draping them like hunting trophies, each one a reminder of a rival humiliated and a victory secured. Soldiers who seized banners often returned home victorious, even if the rest of the battle had gone poorly. The banner was proof that at least one part of the fight had gone spectacularly well. Weapons were another coveted souvenir. A sword forged in a foreign land carried exotic value. A beautifully crafted axe or spear could become a prized family heirloom. Shields, even if damaged, were hung on walls to show off the scars of war. Each mark had a story. This dent, that was from a knight who refused to stop hitting me. This cut, oh, that one nearly ended my career. And this scorch, I stood too close to a flaming arrow. Terrible day, that. Weapons were trophies that blended usefulness with symbolism. The rare souvenir that made you both impressive and harder to kill. Some warriors collected bits of armour, not because they fully fit, but because they symbolised conquering an opponent. Helmets were particularly popular. A helmet taken from a fallen foe was a badge of personal triumph. Some men even wore them afterward, creating a fashion statement equal parts intimidating and mismatched. Nothing confused an enemy more than seeing their own heraldic symbol charging towards them on someone else's head. And then there were the truly odd souvenirs. Pieces of clothing, strips of fabric, belts, purses, even bits of hair. These weren't valuable, but they were personal. A soldier might keep a piece of an opponent's cloak as a reminder of a duel, or a bit of cloth soaked in battlefield mud as a memento of the worst day of his life. Some warriors believed these items carried spiritual significance, that keeping a trophy bound them to the strength or courage of the fallen. Others simply wanted proof for storytelling later. Medieval taverns were full of men waving scraps of armour and shouting, "See this? That's from when I fought 6 men at once." It was usually 2, sometimes 1, occasionally a goat. Cultures varied in their rules. Some celebrated trophy-taking with rituals, others forbade it entirely. Certain religious orders condemned the practice as barbaric, while others quietly accepted it as part of the grim realities of war. In regions where head-taking was expected, failing to bring back a trophy might even earn suspicion. Conversely, in places where the church frowned upon mutilating the dead, a soldier returning home with a bag of ears risked a stern talking to, and perhaps a mild exorcism. But not every trophy was taken for glory. Sometimes it was taken out of fear. Soldiers carried souvenirs as protective charms, objects believed to ward off injury or misfortune. A dagger taken from a fearsome enemy, for instance, might be seen as a talisman against future danger. A piece of mail from a fallen knight could symbolize strength. Even morbid trophies served psychological purposes in a world where superstition and survival were intertwined. And of course, not all trophies stayed on the battlefield. Some travelled far, heads were sent to kings as proof of victory, banners were hung in cathedrals, weapons were gifted to allies, and occasionally families received items belonging to their fallen loved ones, sometimes cherished heirlooms, sometimes puzzling oddities. Imagine receiving a letter reading, "Your son died bravely. Here is the shield of the man who killed him." Comforting? Questionable? Historically accurate? Absolutely. In the end, trophy-taking was a human attempt to impose meaning on chaos. It was a way to turn violence into narrative, to transform survival into proof, to carve triumph from terror. The battlefield might forget names quickly, but trophies, no matter how gruesome, kept stories alive. For all the swords, armour and shouting, a medieval battlefield was never just a military space. It was a deeply spiritual one. Warriors marched into combat believing heaven watched closely, saints stood ready to intercede, and God had opinions about arrow trajectories. So when the fighting ended and the wounded cried out across the quiet fields, the clergy stepped forward. A battlefield priest had one job: help you prepare for death, preferably before it happened. Priests had been present long before the first blow was struck. They walked through ranks offering blessings, sprinkles of holy water, and stern reminders not to commit too many sins before lunch. Some soldiers listened devoutly, others nodded politely while tightening their armour and mentally rehearsing the more practical techniques for not dying. Still, no army would march without a man in robes somewhere nearby, if only because no one wanted to be the first soldier in history to explain to God, "We forgot to bring the priest." Once fighting began, clergy members retreated to safer ground, though safer was a generous word. Arrows didn't care if you wore a robe. Priests stationed themselves behind the lines or near makeshift medical tents, ready to perform last rites for anyone brought to them. Those rites could be delivered quickly. Battlefields weren't known for lingering moments, and a practiced priest could offer absolution in the time it took a soldier to gasp a few final words or attempt an apology for everything he had ever done. When the clash ended, the clergy walked onto the field with solemn purpose. It's hard to imagine a job requiring more courage, stepping into mud slick with blood, past groaning wounded and silent fallen, while knowing each figure on the ground might look to you, literally, for salvation. Priests moved slowly and carefully, kneeling beside those near death, whispering prayers, offering comfort. Even men who had ignored sermons their whole lives suddenly became deeply interested in spiritual matters when a robed figure approached. Monks also arrived, often sent by nearby abbeys. Their tasks were varied: assisting the wounded, offering prayers, retrieving relics, or recovering the bodies of nobles for burial. Monks weren't warriors, but they possessed a kind of quiet resilience. They stepped among the fallen with bowed heads, murmuring chants as if trying to restore sacred order to a place utterly soaked in chaos. Some carried satchels to collect religious items from deceased soldiers, crosses, rosaries, small icons, so they could later be returned to families. One of the clergy's more practical duties was documenting the casualties. While scribes rarely ventured into active combat, priests and monks often had to identify bodies, record names, and report to commanders. It was slow, meticulous work. They checked clothing, insignia, and personal tokens. They knelt in the mud, carefully turning bodies, whispering the names they recognized. Sometimes a wounded man would grab a priest's sleeve and gasp a name, not his own, but his friend's, so the record would be kept. These documents later shaped everything from land claims to inheritance disputes. Without clergy keeping track, medieval bureaucracy, which already teetered on the brink of collapse, would have disintegrated entirely. Then there were the relic hunters, the legitimate kind, not the opportunistic scavengers covered earlier. These monks sought physical manifestations of divine presence on the battlefield. Relics didn't have to be dramatic. A saint's medallion clasped in a soldier's hand, a torn cloak embroidered with a holy symbol, a shard of wood believed to bear sacred protection. These items were treated with reverence. Monks collected them not for profit, but for spiritual preservation, believing they carried stories worth safeguarding. Priests also mediated the delicate balance between mercy and vengeance. They encouraged soldiers to spare valuable prisoners, discouraged unnecessary cruelty, and attempted, sometimes unsuccessfully, to prevent hot-headed warriors from taking justice into their own hands. A priest might step between two men ready to settle a score, relying not on authority, but on the overwhelming awkwardness of harming someone who stood next to a holy man. Religious figures were the medieval equivalent of cool-down buttons, though not nearly as effective as anyone hoped. Despite their sacred roles, priests weren't immune to the battlefield's strange humour. Soldiers teased them with questions like, "Can you bless my sword to hit harder?" or, "If I pray now, does that cancel everything I said earlier?" Priests responded with sighs, carefully worded theology, or in some cases, "Just try not to die before I get there." They were both respected and roped into the bizarre soldier logic of the day. Burials also required clerical involvement. Mass graves were dug and priests offered prayers over the trenches. For nobles or notable warriors, clergy oversaw more formal funerals, washing the body, preparing burial shrouds, and ensuring the deceased received the rites befitting their rank. Sometimes this involved negotiating with rival armies to retrieve a body from contested ground. A tense but necessary task, because nothing caused diplomatic chaos faster than a noble being left in the wrong grave. On the darkest days, priests and monks functioned as the only sources of compassion on the battlefield. Their presence offered a reminder that humanity hadn't entirely abandoned the scene. They knelt beside strangers, comforted the dying, relayed messages to families, and ensured even nameless soldiers received at least one prayer. For men who believed their souls were fragile and death was merely a doorway, these acts mattered deeply. Yet the clergy also recognized a practical truth. War created immediate spiritual problems that required immediate solutions. Soldiers wanted reassurance that their sins, many freshly committed, could be forgiven. Commanders wanted assurance that heaven approved of their strategy. Wounded men wanted to know whether they should hold on or let go. Priests, with a calm voice and a well-worn prayer book, guided each as best they could. And when their long day ended, the clergy stepped away from the battlefield, robes stained, hands trembling, hearts heavy. They had seen the worst of humanity and tried to patch the spiritual wounds as surgeons patched the physical ones. Their work didn't end the war, but it made its aftermath bearable. Once the wounded were carried off, the dead were sorted, and the scavengers chased away from anything too valuable, it was time for the next phase of the medieval battlefield ritual, the commander's debrief. This was the moment when leaders gathered beneath a tent or around a smoky fire to discuss the battle, analyse decisions, and, most importantly, figure out whose fault everything was. If something went wrong, it was the archers. If everything went wrong, it was absolutely the archers. These debriefs ranged from calm, scholarly discussions to chaotic shouting matches resembling tavern brawls, depending on how recently the commanders had slept or eaten. Tensions ran high, especially when the outcome of the battle had not been as glorious as anyone hoped. Commanders arrived with dirt on their boots, dents in their armour, and expressions that suggested they had many words and very few of them were polite. The general, or whoever seemed most in charge at the moment, usually started with a grand declaration. "We fought bravely today," or "The enemy was stronger than expected," or the classic, "You all did well, considering the circumstances." Everyone nodded solemnly, even if internally they were thinking, "Considering the circumstances? You mean the part where we were outnumbered, outflanked, and out of luck?" Medieval commanders, like modern ones, were masters at making disaster sound like a minor inconvenience. Then came the analysis. Where did the lines break? Why did the cavalry charge too early? Who forgot the river crossing was too shallow? Why did one unit wander off in the wrong direction? The answers were rarely clear, so commanders improvised. It was a truth universally acknowledged that every debrief began with the assumption, "It was not my fault." Commanders defended their own decisions fiercely, often leaning on statements like, "My men held their ground," or "we executed our orders perfectly, the problem was elsewhere." Elsewhere was almost always a convenient scapegoat. Archers, for instance, were blamed for everything: firing too early, firing too late, firing too high, firing too low, firing at the wrong target, or, worst of all, not firing because arrows had run out after someone forgot to order more. If archers mysteriously performed well, blame shifted to the cavalry. If the cavalry had done fine, perhaps the infantry hadn't held their formation properly, and if everyone fought well but the battle still felt unpleasant, then clearly the scouts had provided incorrect information, or perhaps the map was wrong, or maybe it was the weather. For commanders who needed even more excuses, there was always divine will. A surprising number of strategic failures were attributed to God having different plans. Very convenient, very untouchable, and very effective at ending debates no one wanted to continue. Blame wasn't the only thing tossed around. So were egos. Medieval warfare was deeply intertwined with social rank. A lesser noble criticising a higher one was practically treasonous. Therefore, critiques had to be phrased with incredible diplomacy. Instead of saying "your flank collapsed," a subordinate might say, "the left side faced overwhelming opposition." Translation: "Your plan was bad, but my neck is valuable." Meanwhile, higher-ranking nobles had no trouble delivering criticism bluntly. Your men retreated because you didn't lead them properly. Medieval leadership was a delicate dance, a dance performed in full armour while trying not to step on anyone who could ruin your career. Then there were the political considerations. Many commanders were not just military leaders but also landowners, courtiers, or heirs to important titles. Every decision on the battlefield had political consequences. Thus, the debrief served as damage control. Leaders worked hard to frame events in ways that preserved their reputations. A disastrous charge became a bold manoeuvre. A late retreat became a tactical regrouping. Accidentally setting one's own siege tower on fire might be described as an unexpected development requiring rapid adaptation. No debrief was complete without the drafting of letters to kings, dukes, or the nobles back home. These letters were masterpieces of medieval spin. They highlighted bravery, minimized mistakes, exaggerated victories, and softened defeats until they sounded like temporary setbacks. A devastating loss might be described as a learning experience. A narrow victory might be inflated into a triumph ordained by heaven. Commanders used flowery language to disguise the more embarrassing parts. If a commander's horse ran away mid-charge, the letter might read, "I dismounted strategically to better assess the field." If he fell into a ditch, it might become, "The terrain offered challenges that I navigated with agility." One can almost hear the quills sighing as they attempted to keep up with the creative retellings. Sometimes the letters contradicted each other. A king might receive one glowing report claiming an easy victory, and another suggesting the army barely escaped annihilation. Sorting truth from ego was a skill monarchs developed out of necessity. Many kings learned to read phrases like "spirited resistance" as "we suffered terrifying casualties," and "the men showed great resolve" as "half of them ran and the other half considered it." Commanders also had to maintain morale. Demoralized army was a defeated one. So even in private meetings filled with criticism, leaders eventually turned toward rebuilding confidence. They planned next steps, reinforcing supply lines, sending scouts ahead, or repositioning troops. They assured their men that the next engagement will be different, which was either a promise or a prayer, depending on how things were going. By the end of these debriefs, tempers cooled, plans formed, and exhaustion took over. Commanders staggered away from the tent with the same expression soldiers wore, leaving a long sermon, relieved it was over, unsure what had been accomplished, and hoping God wasn't too disappointed. Returning to camp after a medieval battle was a surreal experience. Part relief, part exhaustion, part "what just happened to me?" Soldiers staggered through the camp gates like ghosts wearing dented armour, their faces caked in dirt and dried sweat. The battlefield's clamour was gone, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by murmured conversations, clanking metal, and the occasional groan from a wounded comrade being carried past. The fight might have ended, but the aftermath clung to everyone like smoke that refused to wash away. Dinner didn't nourish you. It reminded you you'd lost your appetite somewhere on the field. Camp became a triage zone long before anyone thought about eating or resting. Soldiers sought out their missing friends, calling names into the dusk, hoping to hear an answering shout. When someone found a familiar face, alive or injured, they sank beside them with a mixture of relief and dread. Those with minor wounds helped carry those with severe ones. Makeshift stretchers creaked, water skins were passed around, and every available patch of ground near the surgeon's tent filled with groaning bodies waiting their turn. But even uninjured soldiers weren't spared the patch-up work. Armour took a beating during battle. Dent removal became a competitive sport, with men hammering breastplates, greaves and helmets back into functional shape. They used stones, tent stakes and sometimes their own fists, not because it worked, but because it felt good to reclaim control over anything. Armourers and smiths moved between tents, offering repairs, sharpening weapons or scolding soldiers for bringing back equipment that looked like it had been run over by a herd of angry oxen. A knight might hold up a shield split nearly in two and say, "Can you fix this?" The armouress, without missing a beat, would reply, "I can make it slightly less embarrassing." Weapons received equal attention. Soldiers cleaned blood from blades, sharpened edges, and replaced lost straps. Archers inspected their bowstrings, rubbing beeswax into them with meticulous care. Men who moments earlier had fought for their lives now focused on small, steady tasks that grounded their minds. The rhythmic rasp of sharpening stones, the creak of leather being mended, and the soft thud of hammers formed a kind of post-battle symphony, one that hummed with shared exhaustion. Food arrived eventually, though calling it food was optimistic. Camp cooks hurried to prepare whatever provisions remained. Stews heavy on water, bread hardened by travel, and meat that had perhaps been fresh earlier in the week. But soldiers ate anyway, shoveling food into their mouths not because they were hungry, but because their bodies demanded fuel. Meals tasted of smoke, sweat, and numb relief. Men chewed mechanically, staring into the middle distance as if trying to remember what normal life felt like. Conversations drifted toward the strange and disjointed. "Did you see that cavalry charge? My shield cracked in half. I think I lost a tooth today, but I'm not sure where." Some soldiers found a spark of humour, laughing not because anything was funny, but because laughter was the only thing keeping the fear at bay. Someone might hold up a mangled gauntlet and declare, "Look, a perfect match for my other mangled gauntlet." Another might describe an absurd moment from the battle, a horse refusing to move, a soldier tripping over his own spear, or an arrow that embedded itself in a tree with such dramatic flair that 3 men applauded. These slivers of humour were lifelines, tiny rebellions against the grimness of the day. Morale fluctuated wildly. Veterans processed the aftermath with practiced stoicism. They had seen fear before, tasted panic, and learned how to tuck those feelings behind a wall of routine. Younger soldiers, however, often shook uncontrollably, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Some sought out priests for comfort. Others sat alone beside their tents, staring at their hands as if seeing blood that had already been washed away. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the emotional whiplash of going from a life-threatening struggle to the stillness of camp. Campfires lit up as darkness settled, casting flickering shadows that made the tents look like a village built by weary spirits. Men gathered around the flames, letting the warmth seep into their bruised bodies. Stories began to flow, not about heroic deeds, but about survival. I thought I was done for when the shield wall broke. Man in blue nearly took my head off. I swear, the ground itself tried to kill me. These weren't boasts, they were confessions, shared quietly among those who understood. While the soldiers recuperated, officers wandered through the camp checking on morale. They offered encouragement, congratulated surviving warriors, and occasionally delivered stern warnings disguised as motivational speeches. A commander might shake a man's shoulder and say, "Good work today," even if the man spent most of the fight hiding behind a rock. Officers knew that bolstering morale tonight meant fewer desertions tomorrow. Eventually, sleep tugged at weary bodies. Some soldiers crawled into their tents clutching blankets or cloaks. Others slept in full armour, too tired or too afraid to remove it. Snores mixed with murmurs and the distant calls of night animals. The camp settled into its uneasy rest, half refuge, half reminder of the day's horrors. Yet even in exhaustion, there was unity. The camp was bruised but alive, shaken but intact. Men who had fought side by side now rested side by side, their fates temporarily woven together by shared misery and the fragile hope that tomorrow might be quieter. When the armies finally marched away, triumphant, defeated, or simply eager to leave behind the stench of blood and smoke, the battlefield did not fall silent for long. Soon, the people who actually lived there began drifting back, farmers, widows, shepherds, curious children who absolutely should not have been allowed near a battlefield, and elders who approached with the slow, cautious steps of those who already suspected bad news. They walked across the same ground where banners had clashed and men had screamed, and they saw the wreckage not as a military event, but as a personal disaster. Congratulations, your wheat field is now a historical site, and useless. Villagers returning after a battle moved hesitantly, as if the land itself might lurch up and would strike them. Farmers surveyed trampled crops that had once represented months of labour, now smashed into mud under thousands of boots. Wheat flattened into the earth, barley uprooted and left to dry where it fell, vegetable plots churned beyond recognition. Even orchards weren't safe. Mounted knights had a way of riding straight through anything green, because horses, famously, did not care about apple harvests. The farmers knelt to sift ruined soil through their fingers, muttering curses that would have horrified any priest within earshot. They looked at their smashed fences and the hoof prints that defied geometry. They found spearheads lodged in plough handles, shields wedged between rows of cabbages, and arrow shafts sticking out of the thatch like bizarre decorations. A village that once smelled of baking bread and livestock now smelled like smoke, rot, and disappointment. Widows walked with different eyes. They scanned the field with dread, searching for familiar clothing or tokens that might have fallen from their husbands or sons. Some found nothing and clung to fragile hope. Others found too much. A scrap of cloth, a dented buckle, a boot they recognized instantly. Their grief filled the spaces where banners had flown just hours earlier. A battlefield stripped of its armies was not quiet at all. It echoed with the cries of loved ones discovering unbearable truths. Children, disobedient and too curious for their own good, followed the adults, poking at broken weapons, skipping around craters, and daring each other to touch abandoned helmets. To them, it was a strange playground full of forbidden objects. To their parents, it was a nightmare waiting to happen. Every few minutes someone shouted, "Put that down!" or "Don't touch that!" or "For the love of God, shut away from the mysterious puddle." Livestock wandered too, not the missing ones, but the ones that had survived. Sheep returned to grazing as if nothing unusual had occurred, nibbling grass between arrows. Goats inspected shields with intense suspicion. Dogs sniffed every strange scent as if trying to reconstruct the previous day's madness. Missing livestock, unfortunately, were another story. Some had fled. Others had been taken by soldiers for food. A few had met less noble ends. Medieval villagers did their best to track animals by hoofprint, droppings, or the equally scientific method of yelling the animal's name and hoping it came trotting home. Houses and barns had not escaped destruction either. Soldiers needing firewood, shelter, or just something to lean on had a habit of dismantling property with cheerful indifference. Doors were broken, roofs were partially collapsed. Windows, rare, précieux windows, were shattered. Villagers stared at the destruction with expressions suggesting they were mentally calculating how many years of taxes it would take to afford repairs. Then there were the burned structures. A battle, especially when panic set in, often involved stray torches, flaming arrows, or a commander shouting, "Scorch their supplies!" with insufficient attention paid to which supplies were which. Returning villagers found blackened beams lying like charred ribs, the remains of granaries still stouldering, and barns turned into ash-filled skeletons of their former selves. In a world where stored grain meant survival through winter, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was devastating. The emotional toll was equally immense. People stumbled upon the remnants of war without the armour of adrenaline to protect them. They saw shattered shields and imagined the arms that held them. They found broken swords and pictured the hands that had swung them. They stepped around bloodstains dried into the grass and felt the memory of violence cling to their clothes. The battlefield to them was not a place of honour or tactics. It was the place where everything normal had been ripped apart. Still, medieval civilians were resilient. After shock came action. Farmers began clearing debris from fields, salvaging what they could. Women gathered usable cloth, pots, wooden planks, anything left behind that could be repurposed. Families formed search parties to look for missing members, checking ditches, thickets and riverbanks. Priests organised prayers for the living and the dead. Neighbours comforted each other with embraces, shared food, and murmured reassurances they only half believed. Life had to go on, even when the land seemed determined to disagree. Economic recovery varied wildly. Some villages were wealthy enough, relatively speaking, to rebuild in a season or two. Others suffered years of hardship. A single battle passing through a region could plunge it into poverty, famine, or depopulation. Local lords sometimes offered aid, but just as often they offered new demands because rebuilding armies cost money. And guess who paid taxes? And yet, amidst the despair, there were moments of dark humour, because humans cling to laughter the way crops cling to soil. A farmer might hold up a perfectly intact sword found buried in cabbage and declare, "At least the steel survived." Someone else might find a helmet dented in exactly the shape of a horse's hoof and decide it made an excellent soup pot. Villagers rebuilt not just with tools, but with the stubborn humour of people who refused to let tragedy have the final word. By the end of the first day, the villagers had transformed from horrified onlookers into grim caretakers of a land reshaped by war. The battlefield no longer belonged to the armies who had fought there. It belonged to the people who had to live with its scars. News of a medieval battle travelled faster than anyone expected in a world without radios, newspapers, or social media. It rode on the backs of exhausted messengers, merchants who exaggerated for sport, priests who preferred moral lessons to accuracy, and soldiers who wanted their families to know they were alive, or at least that they died heroically, depending on who delivered the message. By the time this information reached royal courts, it had already curled into a mixture of truth, bravado, panic, and creative writing. And then the real political chaos began. At court, the first reaction to battle news was usually silence. Not respectful silence, calculating silence. Noblemen leaned in, eyebrows raised, trying to discern whether the outcome helped or hurt their personal ambitions. Courtiers whispered behind feathered fans or tall collars. Scribes prepared multiple drafts of the same announcement because they knew the message would change depending on which noble arrived first to reinterpret events. If the army had won, even barely, the commander's allies erupted into celebration. They praised strategy, praised bravery, praised divine favour, and most importantly, praised themselves for supporting such a brilliant leader from the beginning. Champagne didn't exist yet, but if it had, corks would have been flying into priceless tapestries. Victory covered a multitude of mistakes: poor supply networks, disastrous weather, troop miscommunications, and the troubling fact that nobody was entirely sure what the strategy had actually been. Losses, however, unleashed finger-pointing on a level that made battlefields look cooperative. Noble factions scrambled to distance themselves from the commander, faster than rats from a sinking ship. Advisors whispered, "I always said this was a bad idea," even if they had passionately endorsed the plan 3 days earlier. If the king was mad, suddenly everyone remembered that they warned him. Commanders returning home from a loss often arrived with pre-written excuses, rehearsed statements, and absolutely no desire to talk about the part where everything caught on fire. They marched into the throne room with solemn faces and phrases like unfortunate conditions, unexpected terrain complications, and temporary tactical setbacks. Kings, depending on temperament, responded with icy stares, outbursts worthy of theatre stages, or long, disappointed sighs that carried the weight of 10 generations of monarchs who also dealt with incompetent relatives. Heroic exaggeration entered the narrative almost instantly. If a noble's son fought in the battle, his father declared that he personally saved the left flank, slew 12 enemy champions, and bravely held the line even after losing his helmet, sword, horse, sense of direction, and half his clothing. Meanwhile, the actual soldiers who witnessed the event would later mutter, "He fell off his horse before the fighting even started." But it didn't matter. Families with influence ensured their heroes became legends, while inconvenient truths were quietly escorted out the back door. Foreign mercenaries made ideal scapegoats. If the cavalry charged too early, foreign mercenaries if the infantry retreated too late, foreign mercenaries if the commander misread the map, misheard the signal, or misplaced the king's favourite banner, foreign mercenaries. These men were essential to medieval armies but lacked the political protection of local nobles, making them perfect for absorbing blame. They couldn't defend themselves in court. They were often already travelling home, spending the sale on their wages, or complaining loudly about the food. Royal chroniclers also played a part in rewriting events before the ink dried. Their survival depended on pleasing whoever paid their salary. If the king wanted a story of glorious triumph, the chronicler dutifully wrote one, even if half the army knew it wasn't true. They carefully crafted narratives where divine signs foreshadowed victory, where the king's banner never faltered, where the enemy was always more treacherous than competent. If the battle ended in disaster, chroniclers blamed bad omens, cursed weather, or sinister conspiracies. Medieval history books should be shelved in the creative non-fiction section. Behind closed doors, the political fallout continued. Rival nobles used the opportunity to weaken each other. If a commander returned alive but unpopular, enemies accused him of cowardice, mismanagement, or, worst of all, displeasing God. Any noble with distant blood ties to the throne suddenly found ways to imply that they would have planned the battle better. A few ambitious courtiers floated rumours that perhaps the king himself should reconsider who held military authority. These whispers could turn into formal accusations, duels, or long, uncomfortable dinners. Even commonaires participated in the political game. Town gossip transformed commanders into heroes or villains depending on how the wind blew. A bread maker might claim, "My cousin's husband's brother was there. He said our general hid behind a wagon." That story, repeated enough times, became court rumour, and rumours, especially embarrassing ones, travelled faster than plague. Taxes added another layer of tension. Battles were expensive, and kings needed funds to rebuild armies, pay ransoms, repair settlements, and replace equipment. Thus, after any major conflict, someone, usually peasants, was informed that taxes would be raised. Peasants sighed deeply, wondering why every royal mistake somehow resulted in fewer chickens for their families. For all the chaos, one truth remained. Medieval politics thrived on storytelling. How a battle was remembered mattered more than how it had actually unfolded. Memories bent, facts softened, victories grew larger, defeats shrank, or were blamed on someone conveniently absent. What mattered was who controlled the narrative when it finally reached the king's ear, when the armies finally limped home, when the wounded were tended, the dead buried, the fields trampled, and the politicians finished shouting at each other in dimly lit halls. There came a moment every kingdom dreaded, yet desperately needed: diplomacy. After all, nothing unites two nations like the desire to stop spending money on stabbing each other. The first stage of diplomacy after a battle was the quiet exchange of messengers, carefully selected individuals who possessed equal parts courage, tact, and the ability to ride very fast if negotiations went poorly. These messengers carried letters sealed with wax and dripping with embellished language like, "We remain committed to peace," which roughly translated to, We need a moment to gather our remaining troops before fighting you again. Both sides began by claiming victory, even if one had been thoroughly flattened. This was not arrogance, it was strategy. If you admitted defeat too quickly, the other side's demands ballooned faster than a feast day pudding. So rulers danced around the truth, writing sentences like, "Our forces withdrew to a more advantageous position," instead of "half the army ran for the hills." Medieval diplomacy was a delicate balance of bravado, denial, and hoping the other king couldn't read subtext. Once both sides agreed to talk, negotiators assembled. These delegations included nobles, scribes, priests, interpreters, and at least one man whose sole job was to glare intimidatingly across the table. Meetings took place on neutral ground, borders, riverbanks, or occasionally inside large tents pitched with theatrical care. Everyone arrived dressed in their finest clothing, even if half the wardrobe had been lost to smoke, mud, or a very confused horse. The discussions opened with formal greetings, long, elaborate speeches full of titles, pleasantries, and thinly veiled insults. Your illustrious king fought with unmatched bravery, one side might say, meaning, your king should thank his gods he survived. Your armies showed remarkable discipline, replied the other, meaning please stop threatening us. Our treasury is empty. After exchanging hollow compliments, the real negotiations began. Prisoner exchanges were usually the first topic. Both sides needed their captured nobles back before someone accidentally or deliberately executed them. Negotiators haggled over ransom amounts, sometimes arguing for hours about whether a certain baron was worth 10 chests of silver or only 6 and a goat. Knights often offered to pay their own ransom, hoping to speed things along. Common soldiers, unless particularly useful, were exchanged in bulk, like medieval inventory. We'll return your 50 infantry if you return ours, and please make sure none of them come home wearing enemy boots. Prisoner exchanges were logistical puzzles wrapped in diplomacy, every transaction reflecting status and leverage. Next came territorial bargaining. Land was the currency of medieval power, and battles rarely ended conflicts permanently. Even inconclusive skirmishes prompted leaders to renegotiate borders. A victorious king might demand a fortress, a stretch of fertile farmland, or a river crossing. The defeated side, trying not to sound defeated, offered alternatives. Instead of the fortress, how about these slightly less important fields? They grow excellent sheep. Land negotiations were fraught with ego. No rulers wanted to give up territory, even if they had never personally visited it, couldn't pronounce it, and secretly suspected it was mostly swamp. Giving away land meant admitting weakness, yet keeping land they could no longer defend was equally risky. Thus, treaties often ended up with impressively complicated borders that made cartographers question their life choices. Then came the propaganda phase, an unofficial yet absolutely essential element of medieval diplomacy. Each side sought to frame the outcome of the war in terms favourable to them. Victors wanted treaties written in language that reaffirmed their dominance. Losers wanted treaties written in language ambiguous enough to reinterpret later as, actually, this was our idea. Treaties were filled with phrases like mutual understanding and renewed peace and shared commitment to stability, which everyone knew meant something entirely different depending on who was reading it. Kings held public ceremonies announcing peace with dramatic speeches, flourishing banners, and celebratory feasts meant to assure their populace, "Don't worry, everything is fine now," even if negotiations had nearly collapsed twice and might collapse again next Tuesday. Behind closed doors, however, diplomats engaged in subtle bragging wars. Victors boasted about battlefield achievements. Defeated diplomats countered by emphasizing how costly the victory had been for the other side. Records from these meetings reveal exchanges like, "We routed your left flank," answered by, "Our left flank bravely withdrew to preserve strategic flexibility." Both sides lied with remarkable politeness. Diplomacy also involved marriage proposals, a classic medieval solution for everything. If two families married, maybe they'd stop sending armies to kill each other. Or maybe not, but at least the weddings looked impressive. Royal daughters often found themselves traded like high-stakes diplomatic tokens. A king might say, "To ensure peace, my daughter will marry your son," conveniently forgetting to mention that the daughter had just learned about this 10 minutes prior. Religious leaders sometimes mediated the talks. Monks and bishops appealed to divine unity, urged mercy, and reminded rulers that God frowned upon endless slaughter. These appeals occasionally worked, mostly when one side was too exhausted to continue fighting, or too broke to buy more spears. In the end, a treaty emerged, a carefully worded, painstakingly negotiated document that promised peace, prosperity, cooperation, and absolutely none of the hostility that simmered just beneath the surface. Everyone shook hands, exchanged gifts, and pretended this settlement would last forever. It rarely did. Treaties were fragile things, diplomatic insects crushed easily under the boot of ambition, insult, or a badly timed rumour. Yet for a brief moment, diplomacy soothed the wounds left by war. Soldiers could return home, traders could reopen markets, farmers could plant without worrying about knights galloping through their fields again, at least until the next disagreement turned into another chapter written in blood. When the armies marched away and the diplomats began their delicate dance of excuses and exaggerated victories, the battlefield was left in the hands of people who had not fought at all, but now faced the worst of the aftermath. These were the clean-up crews, gravediggers, cart drivers, bone collectors, labourers, and anyone unlucky enough to owe a local lord a favour. They had one job: restore order to land that wanted nothing to do with order anymore. The good news? You weren't in the battle. The bad news? You're here now. Their arrival was never triumphant. They came with shovels, wagons, sacks of lime, spare cloths tied around their faces, and expressions that said, "I don't get paid enough for this," even though most of them got paid nothing at all. Some were hired, some were conscripted, some were volunteers, rare souls with strong stomachs or stronger religious convictions. All of them understood that they were stepping into a place still humming with the echoes of the dead. The first task was the most physically demanding: collecting bodies. In the early hours after battle, corpses lay scattered across the terrain in poses frozen by violence. Clean-up crews moved slowly, stepping between limbs, overturned shields and shattered spears. The air still carried the metallic tang of blood, and insects had already begun their gruesome work. Labourers grabbed bodies by arms, legs, or whatever remained intact. Some corpses came up easily, others stuck to the mud, requiring 2 or 3 men to tug free. Each lift was a reminder that armour made everything heavier, including death. Cart drivers followed behind, steering creaking wagons meant for wheat or tools, but now burdened with the weight of war. Horses resisted the task instinctively, snorting and pulling away from the scent. Drivers coaxed them forward with whispered reassurances or firm tugs on the reins. As the carts filled, wooden boards groaned under the mass. When full, they trundled toward the dug burial trenches, their wheels cutting messy lines into soil already trampled beyond recognition. While bodies were the most urgent burden, equipment had to be cleared too. Abandoned shields, torn banners, broken weapons and splintered wagons covered the ground like the remains of a metallic storm. Labourers gathered everything usable into piles for later repair or melting down. Everything too damaged was burned or thrown into pits. Collecting equipment required careful eyes. After all, an uncollected sword was both dangerous and valuable. Many men swore they could always tell when a blade was lying nearby because their spine tingled. Others tripped over it. Then came the least glamorous job: bone collecting. Not all remains stayed where they had fallen. Scavengers, both human and animal, had scattered pieces across the field. Weeks or months after the battle, when grass regrew over the churned soil, farmers ploughing fields would discover ribs lodged beneath roots or skull fragments washed into creek beds. Bone collectors carried sacks or baskets, moving through the area long after the first burials, gathering anything human-shaped to be reinterred properly. It was quiet, sombre work done without fanfare. Some whispered prayers with every bone placed in the sack. Others simply focused on not thinking too much. To help with decomposition and hygiene, crews used quicklime, scattering it over mass graves and around the field. It hissed when it met moisture, a sound that made even seasoned workers flinch. The smell that followed was sharp, stinging the eyes. Lime was not elegant, but it stopped disease from spreading to nearby villages. No one liked applying it, but everyone appreciated surviving afterward. Cleanup crews faced hazards beyond emotional strain. Hidden dangers littered the field. Unexploded siege projectiles, old trebuchet stones or pots of flaming pitch could still injure. Half-buried weapons lay waiting for careless steps. Decomposing bodies carried diseases. Sharp metal edges sliced through gloves. Even the ground posed danger. Churned soil hid holes deep enough to break ankles or swallow small carts. Every step tested balance and nerve. Despite the grimness, there was unexpected camaraderie. Workers talked while they dug, sharing jokes because humour was the only shield they had left. One man might mutter, "At least the bodies aren't fighting back," and another would groan at the terrible attempt at levity. When the stench became overwhelming, someone always made a remark about wishing they'd chosen a different profession, even if they had never been given a choice. Laughter was sparse but meaningful. It reminded them they were still alive in a place where many were not. Sometimes the task took on deeper meaning. Cleanup crews occasionally stumbled upon personal items, rings, letters, bits of clothing, and set them aside for families or commanders. These discoveries brought human stories flooding back to a place that had tried to forget them. A ring engraved with initials could spark a moment of silence. A half-finished letter found in a torn satchel might be read aloud, leaving the men contemplative. One man's tragedy became many men's reflection. The process took days for small battles, weeks for large ones. When all visible bodies were buried and debris removed, crews returned with rakes and tools to smooth the land, allowing farmers to reclaim fields or letting nature slowly heal the scars. Grass eventually grew over the disturbed soil. Birds returned to nest. The wind carried fewer reminders, but the ground never forgot, and those who worked it never forgot either. By the time they finished, the battlefield looked almost peaceful. Almost, if you ignored the uneven terrain and the faint memory hanging in the air. Cleanup crews walked away exhausted, their clothes stained and spirits dimmed, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that wars were not just fought by armies, but endured by everyone who had to live with their aftermath. If there was one universal truth about medieval battlefields, it was this: the fighting ended long before the danger did. Once the swords stopped swinging and the armies marched away, a new enemy slipped quietly into the ruined landscape. One far less dramatic, but infinitely more patient. If the swords didn't kill you, the bacteria were happy to take a turn. The problem began almost immediately. Corpses, human and animal, did not politely wait for someone to bury them. Heat accelerated decay. Rain muddied everything into a foul soup. Wounds began to seep, bodies bloated, and flies arrived in biblical multitudes. No medieval chronicler needed a microscope to understand that something terrible lived in the air around a rotting battlefield. People could feel it. They could smell it. They watched it crawl, swarm, and fester. And still, sometimes the dead lay unburied for days or weeks simply because there were too many of them, or because the army had moved on too quickly, or because no one had the manpower or the stomach to deal with the problem in time. The most immediate threat was water contamination. Battlefields were rarely located far from rivers, streams, or wells. Armies needed water for drinking, cooking, and animals. But corpses lying near waterways quickly turned fresh streams into toxic channels of sickness. Blood, waste, and decomposing flesh seeped into the ground and ran downhill. Villagers returning home had no idea that the river they had used for generations was now a delivered invitation for dysentery, typhoid, or worse. A single unlucky sip could spread illness through an entire settlement. For communities already bruised by loss, disease was the final cruel blow. Then there were the horses. A medieval army's strength depended heavily on its mounts. which meant hundreds, sometimes thousands, of horses died alongside their riders. And a rotting horse was not just a corpse, it was a catastrophe. Too heavy to move quickly and too numerous to bury efficiently, dead horses remained on battlefields long after the men were collected. Their carcasses swelled, split, and collapsed, releasing smells so powerful that even people accustomed to medieval hygiene backed away gagging. These massive bodies attracted scavengers, insects, and eventually clouds of bacteria drifting invisibly on warm winds toward nearby camps and villages. Rotting animals were also playgrounds for vermin, particularly rats. Rats scurried over corpses with unaffected enthusiasm, feasting, breeding, and carrying fleas that jumped happily to living hosts. While not every plague outbreak could be blamed on a battlefield, many were accelerated by them. A single rat-infested wagon leaving the site could bring catastrophe to whatever town it rolled into next. Medieval armies marched with more than weapons. They marched with ecological disasters hitching rides in their supply carts. Unburied bodies also created localized plagues among soldiers. It wasn't uncommon for an army resting near its own battlefield to begin showing signs of sickness within days. Men who survived combat now found themselves bedridden with high fevers, vomiting, diarrhea, or blackened sores. Commanders initially blamed bad air or divine displeasure, but soldiers knew the truth. The longer the dead stayed unburied, the more the living fell ill. Even hardened warriors who had marched through mud and blood without flinching grew nervous when they saw ravens and flies thick enough to darken the ground. Disease didn't stay politely in camps either. It travelled. Soldiers returning home carried invisible hitchhikers in their clothing, beards, or wounds. Villages that welcomed heroes found themselves hosting outbreaks a week later. Newly widowed families suddenly nursed fevers. Children fell sick with no direct contact with the battlefield at all. A single battle could ripple outward, turning into a regional crisis long after the fighting ended. Villagers, for their part, often tried their best to minimize exposure. They approached rotting bodies with cloths wrapped around their faces and prayers muttered under their breath. Some dug shallow graves out of desperation, unable to manage deep ones without proper tools. Others collected corpses onto wagons and moved them far from town, out of sight, out of smell, out of mind, but not necessarily out of danger. In wet weather, the earth failed to hold the bodies, and villagers would return to find limbs or bones exposed again. It was gruesome, demoralizing, and utterly exhausting. Religious leaders encouraged burning incense, hanging herbs, or filling rooms with bitter-smelling smoke believed to purify air. These methods helped psychologically, if not medically. Some communities lit enormous fires near water sources to keep foul vapours from drifting in. Others turned to saints known for protecting against plague, holding processions through streets already haunted by sickness. Prayer was not a solution, but it offered comfort, the spiritual equivalent of holding a shield against an invisible enemy. Meanwhile, commanders sometimes enforced quarantines, though the term didn't yet exist. They forbade soldiers from bathing in rivers contaminated by bodies. They moved camps uphill. They ordered slower pace marches so sick men could be left behind. Harsh, but practical. A single sick company could infect an entire army, and medieval leaders knew enough to fear disease as much as any opposing force. Even nature itself seemed to recoil. Animals avoided contaminated zones. Birds circled overhead but landed reluctantly. Dogs sniffed the air, whined, and backed away. It was as if the land held its breath until the dead were finally laid to rest. Mass graves, when eventually completed, brought some relief, but not immediately. Until the earth settled and lime did its work, the smell of decay lingered for weeks. Travellers passing through these areas commented on headaches, nausea, or a sense of evil wind. Chroniclers described valleys where the air tasted of death. Those who lived nearby grew accustomed to a constant reminder that people had perished close enough to change the environment, and yet life resumed. Disease outbreaks eventually burned out or receded. Clean water returned. Farmers ploughed around old burial sites. Grass grew over bones. Children played on hills that had once held trenches of the dead. Medieval people adapted because they had to. The world did not give them a choice. But even centuries later, some fields refused to forget. Strange outbreaks, persistent soil discoloration, or odd growth patterns became reminders of past battles. Nature healed, but it remembered. Every medieval battle ended with its official lists. The dead, the wounded, the captured, the promoted, the demoted, and, most troubling of all, the missing. These were the names that hung in the air like half-formed questions. Men who had marched into the fight but never marched out again. Not fallen in glorious combat, not dragged off as prisoners. Not spotted among the wounded. Simply gone. Some men didn't die, they just retired early without telling anyone. The reasons for disappearing were as varied as the men themselves. Desertion, for instance, was more common than any commander was willing to admit. When the battlefield erupted into chaos, when formations broke and screams drowned out commands, many soldiers made split-second choices that felt less like cowardice and more like survival strategies. One moment they were swinging swords, the next they were sprinting toward the nearest tree line, diving into bushes, or belly crawling toward anything resembling safety. Some deserters planned their escape, others improvised. A panicked man might throw off his helmet, cast aside his shield, and run with such determination that even his own shadow struggled to keep up. Forests that bordered battlefields were full of men hiding under roots, behind fallen logs, or inside hollow trees. By the time armies regrouped, these men were miles away, stripped of armour, and halfway into a new life they hadn't exactly prepared for. A few deserters reinvented themselves successfully. They became farmhands, peddlers, or hermits. Others, lacking any marketable skills besides put pointy thing into opponent, wandered into villages claiming to be survivors of a shipwreck or victims of bandits. Most common folk didn't ask too many questions. They simply handed the stranger a shovel and told him to start digging. It wasn't glamorous, but it was undeniably better than bleeding out on a battlefield. But desertion was only part of the mystery. Kidnapping also played its role, especially on chaotic battlefields where confusion reigned. Rogues, opportunists, and passing outlaws occasionally lurked near the edges of conflict, not to participate but to capture wounded or isolated soldiers. These victims weren't taken for ransom, they were taken for labour. A strong young man missing a few teeth but still breathing could be forced into farm work, rowing, or even petty banditry. Families never learnt their fates. In the eyes of the army, these middlemen had simply vanished. Then there were the unrecorded captives, soldiers taken prisoner without official acknowledgement. Battles were large, armies scattered. Not every capture was witnessed or reported. A wounded man left behind might be picked up by an enemy patrol days later, marched off to a remote fortress, and integrated into a prisoner workforce. Some captives became servants, others became bargaining chips. A few, very few, earned trust and settled into new lands, marrying into local families and quietly forgetting the life they once led. But perhaps the most haunting were those who disappeared without explanation, swallowed by nature, chaos, or simple bad luck. Battlefields were vast and bodies weren't always found. A fatally wounded soldier could crawl into tall grass or behind a boulder and never be discovered by either side. Rain, animals, and time erased clues. When tiding crews arrived days later, they might overlook a ditch or a thicket. A man could lie there until only bones remained, and bones do not carry names. Some soldiers wandered off in feverish confusion. Infection, delirium, and blood loss led men to stagger far from the battlefield, muttering incoherently as they followed hallucinated voices or imagined paths to safety. A few reached distant hamlets where they collapsed in barns or by roadside shrines. Kind strangers buried them locally without knowing their identity. Their families mourned without closure. There were also men who lost themselves on purpose, not deserters at first, but soldiers who simply didn't want to return home. Maybe they feared punishment. Maybe they bore shame. Maybe battle changed them so deeply they couldn't face their families. Medieval life offered few ways to disappear cleanly, but war provided a window. A man could shed his armour, change his name and walk into the countryside to start fresh. It was not an easy life, but it was his own. And then there were the stories, half legend, half truth, of soldiers taken by the wilderness itself. Forests, marshlands, and mountain paths bordered many battlefields. A soldier fleeing danger could become hopelessly lost. Some fell into ravines, others drowned in streams swollen by rain. Some encountered wolves or bandits. For every missing name recorded in a lord's ledger, there were dozens of possibilities, none of them comforting. Families bore the brunt of these disappearances. A widow might spend months searching for news, riding to monasteries, writing to commanders, or asking travellers if they had seen her husband. Mothers visited battlefield chapels, whispering prayers to saints of hopeless causes. Children grew up believing their fathers might return someday, tales that flickered into adulthood and then into silence. Commanders handled missing soldiers with administrative bluntness. After a certain period, the missing man was declared dead. This allowed property to pass to heirs and debts to be settled. But in the minds of those left behind, the missing were neither alive nor dead. They existed in a twilight realm of memory and uncertainty. Villagers sometimes claimed to see ghosts of missing soldiers wandering old battlefields on misty mornings. Chroniclers who loved drama eagerly recorded such tales. Soldiers themselves shared campfire whispers about men who walked into the trees and never came out, insisting these weren't cowards but cursed souls. It added a supernatural haze to an already tragic reality. And yet, amidst all this loss, a strange irony remained. Some missing soldiers did eventually reappear, years later greyer, humbler, carrying stories so unbelievable that even the best liars looked impressed. They returned not as warriors, but as wanderers who had finally found their way back. War swallowed men in many ways. The missing were its quietest victims, lost not to swords but to circumstance, confusion, and the sheer immensity of chaos. The road home after a medieval battle was rarely triumphant, even for the victors. Soldiers limped, shuffled, or rode back toward the towns and villages they had left behind, some with the swagger of men who had stood in the furnace of war and survived, others with the hollow silence of those who had seen too much. Returning home was not just a physical journey, but a transformation, one that family and friends often struggled to understand. You left home a hero. You returned home with stories, scars, and a smell your family no longer recognizes. As men approached their villages, the first reactions varied wildly. Children ran forward in delight, tugging on sleeves and begging for tales of battle. Neighbours gathered, eager to hear which local boys had survived and which rumours were true. Mothers embraced sons so tightly that even chainmail creaked. But behind the joy lay anxiety. Every missing face created a silent circle of grief. Wives scanned the ranks, hoping to spot familiar eyes. If they didn't, hope turned quickly into dread. Those who returned bore visible and invisible wounds, broken bones that had healed wrong, missing fingers, deep cuts that would become permanent scars. Some men came home with injuries that prevented them from ever lifting a plough or wielding a tool again. In a world where physical labour was survival, a battlefield injury could devastate a family's livelihood. Villagers admired scars, up to a point, but admiration didn't feed children. The psychological wounds were harder to hide. Medieval people did not have the language for trauma, but they recognized its symptoms. Soldiers startled at sudden noises, gripping imaginary weapons. Some woke screaming from nightmares. Others wandered away during chores, staring into the distance with the look of someone still hearing battle cries no one else could hear. Neighbours murmured that such men were touched by spirits, marked by death or troubled by shadows. Priests offered prayers, wise women offered herbs. What they couldn't offer was understanding. How do you explain to someone who has never fought what it feels like when suspense becomes louder than war? War also changed how soldiers saw themselves. Some came home invaded with pride. Eager to retell their exploits at every tavern table, they embroidered their stories, adding heroic flourishes, insisting they had personally held the line while everyone else panicked. The local youths gathered around these men as if around travelling bards, drinking in every exaggerated detail. These returning heroes enjoyed a brief season of admiration. Free drinks, meals offered by grateful neighbours, and that intoxicating sense of importance before normal life settled in again. Others returned home quietly, reluctant to speak of what they had seen. When asked how the battle went, they replied with vague phrases, hard, bloody, or no man should see such things. Their silence unsettled people far more than boasting would have. These men often slipped back into village life like ghosts, their movements deliberate, their tempers unpredictable. A dropped pot might send them ducking instinctively. The slam of a barn door could turn their face pale. Families too faced the challenge of reintegration. A wife who had managed the household alone for months suddenly found herself adapting to a husband who behaved differently. He might be more distant, more irritable, more withdrawn. Children who expected a cheerful reunion found instead a father who struggled to smile. Medieval families lacked words for emotional healing, so they simply endured it, hoping time would smooth the rough edges. Economically, returning soldiers faced new difficulties. A man who had missed a planting season or harvest returned to fields that were out of rhythm with his life. Tools had rusted, livestock had wandered off or been sold to pay taxes, the war had taken their labour, and now peace demanded its price. Some veterans sought to work as guards, caravan escorts or enforcers for local lords, jobs that made use of their battlefield skills. Others rejoined rural routines, but with bodies no longer suited to the grind. The romantic idea of returning victorious never included the reality of rent still due. Yet there were moments of light. Reunions did sometimes feel like triumphs. A soldier lifting his child up for the first time in months. A husband kissing his wife as if rediscovering the world. Neighbours helping rebuild a veteran's home. Feast days where survivors gathered to celebrate still being alive. Communities, for all their flaws, rallied around those who returned, stitching them back into the social fabric one kind gesture at a time. Finally, reputation lingered. A man who fought bravely gained status, sometimes even land or a position in the Lord's retinue. A man rumoured to have fled the field, even unfairly, found whispers following him for years. Medieval memory was long, and stories, true or not, tended to grow legs and run. In the end, coming home was not an ending, but a second battle. A battle to reclaim ordinary life, to rebuild identity, to tame the echoes of war. Some men succeeded, some struggled quietly, some never fully returned at all, even as they walked familiar roads. For anyone looking back from the comfort of the modern world, medieval battles seem like a catastrophic combination of poor planning, bad hygiene, worse communication, and far too many pointy objects. Yet to the people who lived through them, these conflicts made a kind of sense, an emotional, cultural, and political logic embedded so deeply in their world that war felt as natural as harvest or winter. The good news? You survived the medieval battlefield. The bad news? Now you understand why history books are so dramatic. At the heart of medieval warfare was honour culture, a force so powerful it could drag entire kingdoms into conflict. Honour wasn't a polite concept, it was a social currency. A noble's reputation was his livelihood, political capital, and personal pride bundled together. If someone insulted your lineage, besmirched your heraldry, or failed to show proper deference, suddenly swords were being sharpened. To a medieval noble, refusing a challenge wasn't prudence, it was surrendering status. Honour demanded public action. And nothing was more public than leading a banner into battle while wearing a helmet shaped like a lion having a bad day. Honour wasn't only personal, it was collective. Towns, guilds, families, and even entire regions claimed identity through feuds and alliances. Battles affirmed who belonged where in the social order. Surviving soldiers returned home as a living proof of loyalty. Fallen men became symbols of martyrdom or family legend. Honour transformed ordinary people into characters in a story their community retold for generations. Layered atop honour was feudal obligation, that wonderfully complicated system where everyone owed something to someone else, usually at the worst possible moment. A lord protected his vassals. Vassals owed military service. Peasants owed labour to support the entire machine. A call to battle rippled through this hierarchy like a stone dropped into still water. A peasant might not care about border disputes or noble feuds, but if his lord called him to war, he went, because refusing wasn't an option unless one enjoyed the idea of losing land, livelihood, or assorted body parts. Feudalism made warfare predictable. Everyone knew their role. Knights served mounted and armoured, leading charges with banners fluttering behind them. Foot soldiers provided the numbers. Archers balanced skill with expendability. Each rank supported the one above it, and the system worked, at least from the perspective of those who designed it. To medieval minds, war was the glue that reinforced these social bonds. A knight who fought bravely proved his worth. A vassal who served loyally strengthened his lord's authority. Even peasants gained a strange kind of pride from contributing to a victory, though usually not enough to compensate for the backbreaking work that followed. Then there was divine will, an idea so central to medieval life that every major decision involved some attempt to interpret God's opinion. Battles weren't just political, they were cosmic events. Victories confirmed righteousness. Defeat suggested sin, divine testing, or an unfortunate saint temporarily falling asleep on the job. Commanders prayed before battle because they believed heaven had a stake in the outcome. Priests blessed swords, banners, armour, and occasionally soldiers who looked like they needed extra help. This belief in divine participation created a powerful sense of purpose. War wasn't meaningless, it was part of a divine narrative. Soldiers fought not only for lords, but for salvation, justice, or the protection of their community. Even the most hardened fighters paused to thank God for surviving a battle, or to question why he had allowed their best friend to fall. The battlefield became a place where mortality and faith collided with brutal immediacy. Yet medieval warfare wasn't just emotional or spiritual, it was politically necessary. Land disputes, succession crises, taxation arguments, and fragile alliances turned Europe into a minefield of competing interests. If a king failed to enforce his claims through military strength, rivals filled the void. Military displays were less about annihilating enemies and more about sending messages. Don't test me. This border is mine. My son will inherit, and yes, you'll accept it. To modern readers, some of these conflicts seem absurd. To medieval rulers, they were survival. Battles were often the quickest, if not the cheapest, way to resolve disputes that diplomacy failed to untangle. A decisive victory could reshape a kingdom, secure a marriage alliance, or strengthen a fractured throne. Even stalemates had value. They reminded subjects that the king was active, strong, and willing to defend their interests. And while war devastated ordinary civilians, rulers frequently viewed it through the lens of long-term strategy rather than immediate suffering. Social identity also played a central role. War shaped how communities understood themselves. Knights defined their worth by martial skill. Peasants tied their fortunes to their lord's power. Entire regions developed reputations. Fierce borderlands, loyal vassal territories, rebellious provinces. Stories grew around battles like vines around stone, tales of heroism, sacrifice, betrayal, miraculous escapes. These narratives became collective memory, teaching new generations who they were expected to become. Even tragedy reinforced identity. A village that lost many sons became known for its sacrifice. A noble family that fell in battle became a symbol of loyalty. A king who led his men personally even into disaster was remembered with reverence. War shaped medieval society's understanding of duty, courage, and destiny. And of course, battles persisted because people expected them. The mindset didn't question whether war should happen. It assumed it would. Training, literature, religion, and politics all prepared men for conflict long before swords were drawn. Medieval people didn't live in denial about war's horrors. They simply accepted those horrors as part of life. So yes, medieval battles were chaotic, brutal, and deeply destructive. But within the medieval world view, they were also logical, meaningful, and often unavoidable. They reinforced hierarchies, protected claims, honoured gods, and expressed identity. In the end, war was the stage on which medieval society performed its grandest and most dramatic rituals. Each battle left scars on land and people alike, reshaping not only borders but beliefs. And as you now know, nothing explains the dramatic flair of medieval history quite like understanding the world that created it.